About a year ago, I was in Portland on book tour for the Science of Good and Evil and kind of making the rounds of the usual talk shows. And I was on one TV talk show with a couple of people that had produced a film called What the Bleep Do We Know? And it had just opened that day in Portland, just in one theater in Portland. And, you know, they were excited to, sort of give me one of their DVDs and watch this great video. And it was about consciousness. And I thought, okay, all right. Are you guys like neuroscientists or something? No, we're filmmakers. Okay. And anyway, so I watched it, and I figured, well, it's sort of interesting, I guess, and it's artistically it's a nice production, but I didn't think it would go anywhere. Well, it's become kind of this cult hit film. It's played all over America in hundreds of theaters, and they've made a lot of money. They did well, and it's kind of generated this whole interest in consciousness being explained by what? By quantum physics and other things, what Murray Gell-Mann here called quantum flapdoodle. Featured in the film is the University of Oregon quantum physicist Amit Goswami, for example, who says, "The material world around us is nothing but possible movements of consciousness. I'm choosing moment by moment my experience." Heisenberg said, "Atoms are not things, only tendencies." So I wrote a column about this in Scientific American, and I said, "Okay, Amit, I challenge you to leap out of a 20-story building and consciously choose the experience of passing safely through the ground's tendencies." The film also features Masaru Emoto, the author of The Hidden Messages in Water. I don't know if you've seen this book. It's at most of the New Age bookstores. I've even seen it at Barnes & Noble, Borders. It's a sort of picture coffee table type book in which he takes glasses of water and freezes them with a word taped on the side, just like a piece of tape with a word written on it, taped on the side. And the word determines, he thinks, the shape of the crystalline structures. So, for example, if you tape love to a glass of water and freeze it, it has this really beautiful symmetrical crystal. If you tape, and I'm not kidding, Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel, you just write Heartbreak Hotel, the crystal splits. Splitsville or something. I wondered what Burnin' Love would do to that. The film's nadir is none other than Jay-Z Knight. I knew as soon as I saw this that this was bullshit. If you don't know Jay-Z Knight, she's an actress, in my opinion. That's all she is an actress, who claims she can channel Ramtha, a 35,000-year-old spirit warrior who speaks English with an Indian accent. Now, where they spoke English with an Indian accent 35,000 years ago, I'll leave it up to the archaeologists to figure that one out. It turns out when I looked into it, the film was largely financed by her group, whatever you cult group, whatever religion, whatever it is up there, the Ramthites up in Washington. But they do feature Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff in their what is supposed to be a serious explanation for consciousness, which is that inside these little microtubules, which are these like little scaffolding inside cells, and neurons have them too, if there's something like a vacuum in there, and if it's not too warm and mushy, which brains tend to be, there could be the possibility of like a wave collapse. The wave function collapses if it's stimulated by thought in a certain way. And that the quantum, I'll just read it, what it's supposed to be. The quantum coherence causes neurotransmitters to be released into the synapses between the neurons, thus triggering them to fire in a uniform pattern that creates thought and consciousness. Because a wave function collapse can come about only when an atom is observed, that is affected in any way by something else. It's suggested that the mind may be the observer in this sort of recursive loop from atoms to molecules to neurons to thought to consciousness to mind to causing the wave function to collapse to atoms to molecules and so on. Well, okay, so that's a scientific claim. Is there any legitimacy to it? So I asked my quantum physics friends about this, and they said it's bullshit. And but why? Why is it? I mean, you can't just say that. Why? What's wrong with that? And as I understand it, quantum effects happen at a very small scale. Neural effects happen at a very big scale. According to Vic Stanger in his book Unconscious Quantum, for something to be considered quantum mechanical, its typical mass, m, speed, v, and distance, d, must be on the order of Planck's constant, h. If mvd is much greater than h, then the system is probably classical, not quantum. And by his estimation, and I've checked with others on this too, there's about a 2 to 3 orders of magnitude difference in size between these little quantum effects and neurons firing. So there's nothing there, scientifically speaking. But why are they doing that? So I sort of concluded this column by saying, because they have this physics envy, that the arrow of causality points down. And sometimes that is the case, but other times the arrow points up. The arrow of causality points up. I think to explain complex systems, we need complex explanations, not necessarily physics explanations. It should be biology envy, not physics envy. So that, in part, is what kind of stimulated me to have this conference on this particular subject. Actually, having the conference was I got talked into it by my friend Chuck Lemmy from Arizona, who's here today. After spending a month with him in the Galapagos, he had my ear bent on many a beach and mountaintop and said, you should do another conference. So here we are. Thanks, Chuck. And the idea of consciousness, well, okay, it's a big subject. I remember reading a review of Dan Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained, which is this huge book. And the reviewer said he explained everything but consciousness. And what's a philosopher doing explaining consciousness? Isn't this something that brain people should be doing? So that's why primarily we have brain people here and not philosophers. 2 examples. I'm going to show 2 short video clips, and then we'll start the show with bringing Roger up and our speakers. Many of you have heard this story already, so I won't do the whole thing. But in 1983, if you recall from reading Weird Things, I was abducted by aliens. And this was on a lonely rural highway, out near Hagler, Nebraska, which is always where these things happen. They never happen somewhere where there's other people around to film it. And, the bright lights, shining on the side of the road and stopped me, and the aliens came out and abducted me, and I had 90 minutes of missing time. And anyway, that whole story. And so I explain this, and I give the denouement that this was in the middle of a big session of sleep deprivation. I was in the middle of a transcontinental bike race, 3,000 miles nonstop, and I wanted to see, this was 1983, I wanted to see if I could go. 1982 was the first year, me and 3 other guys founded this bike race, and so I finished third the first year, and I wanted to see if I could go all the way to New York without sleeping. From LA to New York without sleeping at all. Because I'd read that this kid at UCLA in the 70s did like 11 days without sleeping, playing not video games, but the pinball games back in the 70s. So I figured, well, if he could do it, I could do it. Well, you can't, turns out. Maybe you can do it sitting there, but you can't do it sitting on a bike. So I made it 83 hours and about 1,250 miles without stopping. And so this is what triggers it, of course. It's, it's physical exhaustion, it's sleep deprivation, and the aliens and all that. And in my case, the aliens were people from a show. It was a television show in the 60s called The Invaders that were taking over people's bodies, and they looked just like real people, but you could tell that they were aliens because they had stiff little fingers. How advanced alien technologies can, traverse the galaxy, but they can't, and cloning and everything else, but they can't bend their little fingers. Anyway, so I had inculcated into that experience of the moment, right there on the side of the road, this memory from my childhood of this TV show. It was really weird. Why would that happen? Well, so when I've been on these shows with the alien abductees, they say, how do you know it didn't actually happen? And the aliens planted the memory of this bike race. And I've always thought, boy, that is really good. But then I thought, how can I prove this? So I said, all right, and I went, just for you guys, I went and dug out the old ABC Wide World of Sports tapes that I had from the show, from the race. They used to film the race every year. So I found the clip. They weren't there with their cameras when I had the experience. But the next night, when I crossed over the Mississippi River, they were waiting there with their cameras. And so we'll roll the first clip. It's just like 1 minute. And I'm talking about what happened the previous night. Now, you have to remember, this is 1983. I look rather different.
Reached the Mississippi. What Diana and I hadn't known when we spoke of a close race earlier was that Shermer was slowing down. As he told Eric Hyden there on the bridge, he was wasted.
Still feel pretty mentally alert?
No. That's why I gotta get some sleep tonight. That's a really very strange things happened to me last night. I mean, like psychotic type experiences.
Such as?
Thinking my crew was aliens from another planet trying to capture me. Sounds ridiculous, but that's what I thought.
He was still in second place, but he was floundering. And perhaps as he rode on into that damp, chilly night, he was second-guessing himself for participating in a pre-race decision that now appeared to benefit only one man. The race committee, of which both Shermer and Haldeman were members, had stretched the route northward in Illinois to make it go through Harvard, Lon Haldeman's hometown. It left a 200-mile dogleg in which the riders wouldn't make a foot of progress to the...
Okay. I had a lot more hair then. So, obviously we have a physical explanation for this, but what about other things? Okay, I don't claim alien abductees were sleep deprived, but if the same experience could happen under this set of stimulation, it could happen under others, because our brains are all wired in largely the same way. As another example of this, the second film clip I'll show you just as they cue it up, is another guy trying to sort of stimulate these kinds of experiences, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, senses of presence, a guy named Michael Persinger up in Sudbury, Canada at Laurentian University. So when I was doing the show, Exploring the Unknown, we flew up there and I went through his lab, his sort of, you put this helmet, well, you'll see. And he's trying to physically stimulate these allegedly or apparently paranormal phenomenon. So here I've got about a 6-minute clip showing what Persinger does and what he tries to explain, and then I'll make a few comments about that. He's on to something, but I'm a little skeptical. Well.
The experiences these people have had are clearly very real. The question is, do they represent something out in the world or inside the brain? Here at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Canada, people are having these strange experiences every day. The difference, scientists are triggering them with, of all things, magnets.
Here, in the laboratory of Dr. Michael Persinger, science fiction is rapidly becoming science fact. A motorcycle helmet wired to produce magnetic fields which influences the electrical activity of the wearer's brain produces ghosts, angels, and aliens. Since 1971, Dr. Persinger has devoted his research to proving that paranormal encounters are illusions created by the brain itself. Tiny changes in chemistry, minute alterations in electrical activity can create powerful hallucinations that seem absolutely real. These misfirings of the human brain can occur naturally, especially in the brains of intelligent, creative, sensitive people. Data collected from these kinds of subjects has formed the groundwork for a computer simulation of a paranormal encounter.
We know that all experience is derived from the brain. We also realize that subtle patterns generate complex human experiences and emotions. So effectively what we did, thanks to computer technology, is we extracted the patterns, electromagnetic patterns generated from the brain during these experiences, and then we re-expose volunteers to these patterns.
Okay, I'm a time clock.
Easy rider. Dr. Persinger's next volunteer, me. While being wired and blindfolded, I have plenty of time to reflect on what I am about to experience. A very sensitive part of my brain called the temporal lobes, located on either side just above my ears, is about to be bombarded with a series of electromagnetic pulses. The pulses will assault both my memory and my ability to unscramble information collected from my 5 senses. My brain is about to attempt to make sense of some very distorted signals. sit in the dark in perfect silence for nearly an hour. And yes, even a skeptic's mind can start to play tricks on you. I feel a presence rush by me. In fact, I'm not sure that it wasn't me running past myself. I know it sounds crazy, but I really did sense that someone was in the room with me, courtesy of the magnetic influences being created on my temporal lobes.
What's happening to Michael now is he's being exposed to complex magnetic fields. The pulse being generated is that which is associated with opiate-like experiences such as floating and pleasantness and spinning sometimes.
Halfway through my hour of isolation, the computer begins generating a markedly darker experience for my brain.
At this point, there is now another pattern being generated. It's primarily being generated along the right hemisphere, which means it tends to be more associated with more terrifying experiences.
That's right, folks. He said terrifying. Under these conditions, volunteers have reported meeting the devil, being grabbed by aliens, even being transported to hell. At the end of the hour, I can honestly report that temporal lobe stimulation had been responsible for not only a sense presence, but an out-of-body experience as well.
In the first one, it felt like that's one thing that sort of went by me. I wasn't sure if it was me leaving or somebody. There was something that came by me or something. It was very strange. And then in the second round, I did have there was the feeling like I was in sort of in waves, and then like I wanted to come out of my body, but it kept going back in. Yeah, I can really see how if somebody was maybe slightly more fantasy prone and tends to interpret environmental stimuli in a sort of paranormal way, this kind of experience would be a real wild trip.
Certainly, Dr. Persinger's research on electromagnetic stimulation of the brain that seems to produce some of these phenomena are really groundbreaking and very important in confirming what is believed amongst the vast majority of neuroscientists and cognitive neuroscientists, that these beliefs, these percepts, reside in the activity of the brain rather than in the external world.
Temporal lobe stimulation may not be responsible for every encounter with the paranormal, but Dr. Persinger's research may be the first step towards demystifying a large number of age-old puzzles.
400 years ago, the paranormal included what in large part is now science today. So that's the fate of the paranormal. It becomes science, it becomes normal.
About the fate of the paranormal. That's true. In fact, I go so far as to say there's no such thing as the paranormal or the supernatural. There's just the normal, the natural, and all the stuff we have yet to explain what normal and natural means. It's supernatural, paranormal is just a linguistic place filler to hold there until we have an explanation. And I don't know what else it could be. Of course, I'm not in the majority of people who think that the mind may be somewhere else, and that's one of the things we'll be discussing today. So my co-host for this segment, and we're going to move on to getting into the meat of this, Roger Bingham, has thought a lot about this. He produced a beautiful series called The Human Quest on this whole question of qualia, consciousness, mind, where does it come from, and the evolutionary origins of mind, and so forth. Roger's a member of the research faculty at the Center for Brain and Cognition at the University of California, San Diego. He's also associated with the Salk Institute in La Jolla there. It's a beautiful location. He's the author of The Origin of Minds, Evolution, Uniqueness, and the New Science of the Self, which I reviewed for the LA Times. It's a terrific book. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Roger is one of these unique, talented individuals that's into both science and clear communication, which is a nice combination that we need more of that. So after his series, that's really triggered a lot of interest, I think, in the general public in looking for these neural correlates of consciousness and talking to scientists about that. So Roger is going to moderate all of our panel discussions today. I'll introduce the speakers, he'll moderate the panels, and he's going to help us kick off by giving us a brief introduction to the topic at hand and also showing some of his clips from his terrific show. With that, please help me welcome Roger Bingham.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you. Good morning. By way of explanation, You saw from the signs outside that we're actually taping this for the Science Network for later availability on our website, and I just wanted to give you a brief commercial and explain to you what that is. It's a fledgling venture, but the idea, as you can see, is to create a sort of a no-spin zone for science on issues that intersect with social policy. And so it's a kind of a C-SPAN for science, free from the tyranny of the soundbite, which is the sort of thing that I used to inflict on people in making PBS series. Brain-mind consciousness is not exactly the kind of thing that we've been doing. We actually did a couple of symposia on stem cells. We're doing something on aging. We'll be doing something on addiction and so on and so forth. But it seemed that this was such a generic subject in looking at the whole background in evolutionary terms and in individual differences in consciousness and so on, that this was certainly a subject that we should and would cover. So if you want to find out more about us, that's the URL. You'll find that there's a couple of pages there that explain some of the programs that we've already done. You can download the Stem Cell Symposium. You'll find out a list of the advisors that we have, including, I see, Paul McCready, who's in the audience somewhere. And future kinds of programming that we're planning to do, things like a sort of a science week in review, things like Inside the Actor's Studio, except have a scientist explain what their passion is, so on and so forth, science book TV. We always say this at the beginning of the symposia, that and in fact, on the stem cell one, that's exactly what we did. We did the science in the morning, then in the afternoon we had an ethics panel, international implications panel, economic and political implications. We won't be doing that today, but the fact remains that we subscribe to this nostrum of Moynihan's that everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. Now, Sherma asked me to do a couple of things. One was to show some video clips. Second was to remind you that science can claim to be perhaps the quintessential self-correcting process, and I'd like to illustrate that with a personal story. And finally, I want to make a comment about the importance of individual differences when we move into the kinds of science that are implicit in the subject of this conference. The last time I was up here and doing this with Michael was in late March 1996, and the subject of that conference, in fact, I don't know if any of you are here, was evolutionary psychology. And some of the speakers included Don Simons. And I need to put this slide up just to remind you that when I talk about evolutionary psychology, or EP, I'm actually talking about a very specific paradigm, a specific school of folks who were the original theoreticians. People like Leda and John from UCSB and Don, David Buss from the University of Texas, who does a lot of stuff about sexual preferences, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson from McMaster, who look at the childhood infanticide. And then there's the accompanying journalists, Bob Wright, The Moral Animal. You probably know Matt Ridley's books, The Origins of Virtue and Nature via Nurture, which has just been republished as The Agile Gene. And then, of course, Steve Pinker, the most extraordinarily best-selling and successful of the people who do EvPsych. I think I could probably reasonably claim to have been on that list in 1996 because I'd just created a 4-hour primetime series for PBS called The Human Quest, which was, I think, the first lengthy television experience, examination of EP. Although probably not an examination, it was more of a Valentine, I think. As Sherma put it in a review, it was nothing short of adulatory in canonizing the doctrines of this new science. Thank you, Michael. The Bible of the new science was this one, The Adapted Mind. Some of you may know it, by Leda and John and Jerry Barkow. And in this book, I think this is what appealed to me about it was that it set out a very strong Darwinian and adaptationist position. This is just a cover from a magazine that, alas, is defunct. It was published by the AAAS at one point, and I confected for this magazine Darwin's last interview, as you can see, which was conducted 100 years after his death, which I thought would also appeal to Sherman. I used to call the process channeling Chuck, and Actually, most of it was woven from his autobiography and the letters, and Barnes & Noble, some of you may have known, have actually just published a new version of Darwin's autobiography, and there is a slight mistake in it. This audience, I expect, will pick it up, and certainly Michael will. That is Alfred Russel Wallace. Not many copies of these left, by the way. I actually saw this in a bookstore with Ramachandran, and we both got one immediately. He said, "Are there any more?" Let's take these away immediately. So, let's just try and set up this whole notion of natural selection and adaptationism. There is a clip which is about to come up. It's not short, it's about 4 or 5 minutes, but I think it does a reasonably good job of explaining some of this subject. So I'll pick it up after this clip.
Boom, a-boom, a-boom, a-boom.
Every healthy infant comes with a basic survival kit. Mechanisms of the mind, like a language instinct, are standard equipment for human newborns. Now, how does that happen? Well, making minds involves the same process as making bodies. Any body at all. And how is that done? Well, the answer wasn't uncovered using modern brain scans. It came the good old-fashioned way, from two 19th century scientists whose principal tools were the microscope and the butterfly net. To a generation used to space travel, the tall ships that took 19th century scientists on their voyages of discovery seem quaint and old-fashioned. But the riddle those scientists solved is at the heart of a thoroughly modern revolution in our understanding of the human mind. The riddle? How did living things change over time? What explained the existence of everything from beetles and butterflies to human beings? That was the mystery of mysteries in the 19th century. The story of its solution and its continuing impact on how we understand our brains begins with a Welsh naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace setting sail for the islands we now call Indonesia. Wallace made his living collecting birds and butterflies and beetles and selling them to institutions, so he was in daily contact with nature's incredible inventiveness, the profusion of species. And he asked the question, where do they all come from? On the island of Ternate, in between the hot and cold parts of a malaria attack, he had a sudden flash of insight and saw the solution. He wrote a 20-page letter and mailed it to the one man in the world he thought was capable of judging its merit, the more famous half of our story, Charles Darwin. The letter arrived here at Darwin's home in the little village of Down, just south of London. Why don't you come in? Darwin and Wallace were regular correspondents. In fact, this little box of bees was sent by Wallace to Darwin from Indonesia. But it was the letter that arrived that day in 1858 that was the real stinger. You see, Darwin had reached essentially the same conclusions almost 20 years earlier, but for various reasons, including not wanting to offend almost everybody, had decided not to publish his revolutionary ideas. So now, just as he was finally beginning to put something down on paper, it seemed as if Wallace had scooped him. Darwin's response to this long-distance wake-up call was to write this book, The Origin of Species. The cornerstone of The Origin is the idea of evolution by natural selection. Step by step, over millions of generations, natural selection has fashioned complex organisms from the simplest of beginnings. Essentially, it works like this. There are random variations in the individual members of a species. A slightly different eye or different thumb here, a different shape of beak there. Some of these differences give their owners a slight edge in Mother Nature's school of hard knocks. So they survive and reproduce more successfully than their competitors. And those variations are inherited, passed on in the genes. Over time, a new eye may emerge, better at detecting objects. Or perhaps a new beak, better at gathering food. These adaptations, as they're called, may look as if they were designed to solve problems. But as Darwin and Wallace realized, natural selection, by preserving and accumulating chance advantages, was enough to do the job. It's a breathtakingly obvious idea, once it's pointed out to you. And it's the basis of what might be called the first Darwinian revolution. For all its fame and for all the fuss it caused, The Origin has almost nothing to say about people, except in the final few pages, where Darwin can't resist dropping a hint of things to come. In the distant future, he says, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history.
The basic argument is as follows, that our bodies are collections of natural selection's greatest hits. So that we've got hearts specialized for pumping blood, livers specialized for removing toxin, hands with opposable thumbs specialized for grasping, eyes specialized for seeing, and these are adaptations. Now, in the same way, evolutionary psychology, the EP folks, claim that our minds must also contain cognitive adaptations, which are information processing circuits that evolved in response to the same selection pressures that our ancestors encountered in the Pleistocene in order to solve survival problems. And those survival problems would be things like face recognition, mate choice, cheater detection, and so on. These are the categories that they give. And so they actually postulated a confederation of what they claimed to be hundreds or possibly thousands of genetically specified, domain-specific modules, as they're called, sometimes also called in the literature instincts or mental organs. And in fact, in the literature, they go as far as to say that, to remind us that William James used to talk about a proliferation of instincts, that humans should have more instincts than other animals. William McDougall said the same sort of thing. So the idea of instincts is very much in the terminology of EP. And you remember Steven Pinker's second book was called The Language Instinct. There was also some acknowledgement that the mind might contain some domain general mechanisms and some integrative circuitry, but the real heavy loading was to be done by these modules, which could be conceived of as sort of mini computers, each designed, dedicated to solving one problem. So the second point was that the brain, after all, does have these areas specialized for solving adaptive problems. So if we have, in a sense, a modular brain, why not have a modular mind? And this marriage of adaptationism and modularity is perhaps the defining characteristic of the EP enterprise. There was another claim that followed from that, which I'll get to in a second. They also talked about an environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. That does not mean a specific place or time, but that means a statistical averaging of environments in which traits became fixed, and they'd be different for all kinds of traits. There was another claim that followed from that, and that's the sort of this endowment of instincts constituted a universal human nature. So on this view, the cultural differences were simply variations on a theme, locally produced riffs on the psychic unity of humankind, and supporting this notion was the argument from Gray's Anatomy, which you can see here, so that just as you can open Gray's Anatomy and find what appear to be species-typical, universal physical traits that you could find the same sort of thing in the cognitive realm. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but there are some objections to it. You probably noticed that at the beginning of the video, in keeping with the EP gospel, I confidently assigned to every human infant a great deal of built-in circuitry like a language instinct. That was before I knew better. And this, of course, speaks to the ancient debate variously called at different levels of analysis, nature, nurture, or genes, environment, nativism, empiricism, innate versus learned. I actually don't want to get bogged down on this because I think we all assume now that most thinking people know that the versus actually sets up a misleading dichotomy, and that the correct answer is all of the above in some as yet imperfectly understood combination. However, the EP position actually tends towards the nativist end of the spectrum, and I was going to play a clip now showing Steven Pinker. I'm not sure if I should even leave and see whether it works, but let's try it and see how this comes out.
Of things that any normal human being can do unconsciously without thinking are some of the hardest engineering problems that have ever been stated. And you don't get that from a lump of wax or a blank slate. There's just no alternative to thinking about the complex wiring that the genes put into place in order to understand how we can do these magnificent abilities.
Unlike what Steve said there actually is an alternative. And in 1996, I had the great good fortune to be listening to the ideas of Peggy Lacera, who was a postdoc in the EP Capital, the laboratory of John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, where Michael said that I authored The Origin of Minds. He meant co-authored it with Peggy. To make a long story short, she became convinced that the EP folks had got the wrong story, and at a meeting later that summer, it was the Human Behavior and Evolution Society meeting in Evanston, Illinois. She gave a presentation of ideas, which, largely because it was full of EP royalty, fell on somewhat deaf ears. And shortly afterwards, invited me to collaborate with her. And we published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, The Adaptive Nature of the Human Neurocognitive Architecture, an Alternative Model. And we then published a trade book called The Origin of Minds, becoming in the process, as Michael put it, evolutionary psychology revisionists. I don't necessarily recommend this, by the way. You lose an awful lot of friends. I have. The core of the argument was, as Peggy put it in a recent paper, that the first law of psychology is the second law of thermodynamics. In other words, the primary adaptive problem any organism must solve is entropy. You've got to keep your bioenergetic bank balance in the black. And the hallmark of animalian intelligence systems is the capacity to predict the likely costs and benefits of alternative behaviors. So to navigate a biological marketplace in constant flux, you don't need to evolve a separate, genetically specified collection of brain circuits, modules, or instincts for each adaptive problem domain, in our view. What you actually need is an adaptively flexible intelligence system that can respond online to changing environmental conditions, and by functioning as a predictive cost-benefit analysis system, figure out and tell you whether life's getting better or worse in the moment, keeping entropy at bay. So in other words, the selection pressures would have driven the evolution of a functionally plastic neural substrate, which you all have up here, called neocortex. So the neocortex is the adaptation that we're looking for, not this bundle of instincts. And we also talk about adaptive representational networks, which are the representations that you build up as a database in your neocortex. They're yoking together information about the environment, about your internal state, about behavior that you perform, and about the outcome of that behavior, which is calibrated, registered by the ascending monoamines, serotonin, so on and so forth. So the creation, this is all mediated, modulated by the life history regulatory system, which deals with how things go along at different stages of your life. It's basically a hormonal system which is calibrating and generating life stage responses. I could have put up some scientific slides at this point, but I thought these were going to do a more interesting job. And we talk about the creation and deployment of ourselves, how big we should be in any given social situation, any biological marketplace, how we upregulate and downregulate our size, as it were. There's a chapter in The Origin of Minds called What Size Should We Be? We're talking about Alice's Adventures in Wonderland there. We also talk about the importance of the family environment in which you're growing up and constructing your self-representation, and the importance of peers. Frank Sulloway, you probably remember, did a lot of work on firstborns and laterborns and so on. We have a different explanation for that, which is actually in the old PNAS paper. And of course, Judith Rich Harris did a whole book about explaining that peers were more important than parents. In fact, we take some issue with that in the sense that it's whoever is getting you the goods at any point of your development that is a key player in your marketplace at that time. So this can vary enormously and individually. I invite you to explore further some of the primary sources. You can go back and look at David Buss's work on sexual preferences and so on and so forth, and then read some of the new books that have come out. There's a nice book by David Buller called Adapting Minds, which came out literally in the last month. Nice review of it in the Wall Street Journal by Sharon Begley, in which a lot of the factual, the statistical evidence, the surveys that were being done by the EP paradigm are, I think, fairly convincingly at least argued with, if not completely refuted. So I invite you to take a look at those as well. There's one thing I'd like to return to. I should also mention in passing that one of the other books that came out at about the same time as The Origin of Minds, which also is a refutation of that position, because it comes from a theoretical computational, from a computational neuroscience perspective, which is significantly lacking in the EP standard version, because they didn't really seem to have much interest in how all these circuits that they were postulating could possibly be instantiated in actual neural tissue. When you start looking at the neural tissue, the story becomes very much more different. You're working at a completely different scale, and it's a much more fine-grained scale than postulating an entire area that's dedicated to some particular cognitive problem-solving domain. If you look again at the title of the cover of The Origin of Minds, you'll see that the subtitle is Evolution, Uniqueness, and the New Science of the Self, which is a little bit over the top, but that's what publishers like. But the importance here was getting to the notion of individual, and you'll see that a clever designer here is trying to represent that concept by making one of the hemispheres a fingerprint. The system that we've been talking about actually is, I invite you to read Peggy's latest paper plus the book that we did here. The system that we're talking about automatically generates individual differences. And I think that the whole notion of the psychology of individual differences is going to be increasingly important in many of the kind of sciences that we're talking about here. It generates kind of messy experiments in having to try to figure out exactly what is going on. But it does seem to me that what lies under the broad swath of the bell curve is not always, given the design of experiments, going to be the best information that you get. And a lot of the information is often in the tails of these curves, in individual differences. That's a point I'd like to take up with the other speakers, particularly to find out if any of them is aware of any supportive evidence for the strong EP position, and to discuss things like, for example, we know that there are some areas of cortex that are dedicated apparently to certain processing functions, for example. Nancy Canwisher has called the fusiform face area specialized for face recognition. And if that's damaged, to what extent is the ability to recognize faces lost? But does that mean we have a heritable, reliably developing module for face recognition? Or is our intelligence system actually constructing these circuits during development so that we end up with a cortex that seems to have evolved modules, but in fact is nothing of the sort? So, as I said at the beginning, science is a kind of a self-correcting process, however painful that can be, and it was certainly somewhat painful in completely shifting my views 180 degrees. I forgot to mention that this is one of the, this should have accompanied the remarks about face recognition. This is obviously somebody with a highly developed fusiform face area. So I end with these notions of Thomas Henry Huxley's, that the great tragedy of science, they seem to be a little bit in conflict if you think about this. The great tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. And then he also invites you to sit down before facts as a little child and be prepared to give up everything. So perhaps the ugly fact that actually slays a beautiful but incorrect hypothesis actually does have a beauty of its own. And the reason I call these remarks a un apprendo is from this etching by Goya. This was done, this is a self-portrait, a lithograph by Goya, done when he was 80 years old. And he just learned this technique of lithography. And he made this wonderful illustration of himself on his old sticks, just with his long beard, just still hobbling along, but still learning. And that's the way I feel about minds in this case, in my own particular case. I wanted to finish, again, with another clip. So let's at least try that, and if not, I'll simply tap dance for about 30 seconds on the stage. So.
The moon still enchants lovers, even though we have walked on her surface. A rainbow is still one of nature's delights, even though Newton explained its optics centuries ago. And we still marvel at the birth of a child, even though we know the structure of DNA. To explain is not to explain away. To many scientists, their passion to know has a workaday holiness. They speak of moments of almost transcendent pleasure as they make discoveries. Some of them invoke metaphors of the divine. Einstein believed in the God of the philosopher Spinoza, one who reveals himself, he said, in the orderly harmony of what exists. Perhaps that is the best definition of the way of science, a search for order and harmony. And perhaps that is the ultimate human quest.
Perhaps it's not, but we can discuss that later in the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. If you're going to host a conference on the brain and consciousness at Caltech, you don't have to go far to get good speakers, Caltech itself. We have two. Our next speaker is Christoph Koch, who is a professor of cognitive and behavioral biology, where he studies the neural correlates of consciousness right here on campus. Christoph was born in the American Midwest in Kansas City. You were born in, you're from Kansas? Oh, man. Okay. However, he escaped. And he grew up in Amsterdam, Holland, Bonn, Germany, Ottawa, Canada, and in Morocco. So you can try to figure out the accent when you hear the talk here. It's quite unique. Where he graduated from the Lycée Descartes with a French baccalaureate in 1974. He studied physics and philosophy in Tübingen, Germany, and was awarded his Master's of Physics in 1980 and a PhD from the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics in Tübingen in 1982. His dissertation was on nonlinear information processing in dendritic trees of arbitrary geometry. We have his more popular version for sale out here. Christoph worked for 16 years in collaboration with the great Francis Crick, who made a career change, as only he could, from studying DNA to studying consciousness, which at the time was not really an acceptable thing for real scientists to do. It is now. And his book, basically on the neural correlates of consciousness, is a terrific book. It's really the best place to begin to study consciousness at that level and up, from up, not further down, from up. In 2000, Christoph and his son Alexander joined an archaeological expedition to dig up part of the temple built by King Herod in 20 BC in Caesarea along the Mediterranean coast. While he was there, he had an Apple logo tattooed on his bicep. And in addition to signing your book, he will show you his tattoo later today. He says, and I quote, "Together with the Boeing 747 jumbo jet and the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, the Apple Macintosh is the most beautiful and elegant artifact of the 20th century." And no, it's not an iron-on or HEMA tattoo. It's actually the real thing. With that, please help me welcome Dr. Christoph Koch.
I'm going to show you a 40-minute clip. So I actually talk like our governor does, even though I was born in Kansas City. So Okay, so I'll give you three little vignettes, three little stories about how to study consciousness at the level of brains. As Michael mentioned, I worked with 20 years with Francis, and he was my mentor and my colleague and my friend for many, many years, and I miss him greatly almost every day. I have this dialogue with him carrying on in my head every time I listen to some new facts, some new theory about the brain. And together we postulated, and this was done at a time when indeed it wasn't very popular for scientists, for physical scientists to study consciousness. So we said, let's not worry too much about the philosophical problems about consciousness, like qualia and intentionality and other highfalutin words that philosophers have, but let's worry about something that we can do today as brain scientists or as psychologists or as people in the clinic studying patients. Namely, we can study the correlates of consciousness in the brain, in particular the minimal correlates in the brain that are sufficient, jointly sufficient for any one conscious percept. So by conscious percept, we mean, if you hear, for example, if you're conscious of my voice, my funny accent, if you see blue, if you're conscious of a pain, if you're conscious of being angry, if you're conscious of being you, those are all different. They're all different in content, but what they all share with each other, all these different states, is the subjective stance. They're all about something. They all feel like something. And as biologists, of course, we believe that there's evolutionary continuity across species, and certainly we share consciousness with many creatures, if not with all, certainly with mammals, and most certainly with higher mammals such as mice, and monkeys and apes, the great apes. And if you look at the behavior of animals, for example, if you take a typical monkey, train him in a typical visual task, and you take a typical undergraduate, statistically, as long as the person doesn't have to talk, the behavior is really very similar. If you look at the hardware, if you look at the brain itself, if I give you a cubic millimeter, if I give you a little grain of rice, of monkey brain matter, of human brain matter, of mice brain matter, there's maybe only 2 or 3 people in the audience like John Orman who could tell the difference. Because at the level of the hardware, our brain is bigger. It's not the biggest, right? They're much bigger brains like whales or dolphins. But so it's difficult to say what's actually unique about the human brain at the level of the hardware. And certainly if you have pets in your own life, cats or dogs, wonderful creatures, that it's certainly easy to infer that they also have states of seeing, of smelling, of hearing. They can also have emotional states. Where it ends, it's very difficult to say right now. At what species? I mean, it's not an all or none property. It's a gradual property, and where exactly it ends right now, we don't know because we still don't really understand the neural basis of consciousness. So the idea is, for now, let's not worry too much about philosophy. Because we haven't really made too much progress over the last 2,500 years on that topic, but let's study the correlates. You can read Plato and you can read a modern, much, not all, but you can read much of modern philosophy and you don't really have the feeling that there is progress. So underlying every one conscious percept, whether in us or in let's say in a monkey, is the idea that there's some subset of neurons, some coalition of neurons that briefly coalesce, that briefly comes together. By briefly, I mean a fraction of a second. Reflecting the time scale of your mental life. Your conscious things flitter in and out of consciousness. You're conscious of my voice, and maybe next second you feel, you have a painful toe. Your consciousness shifts down there. Then you remember something you should have done, and your consciousness. So it's ever more shifting about. And the correlate of that, ultimately, what gives rise to that. But of course, right now we don't know. So we are careful as scientists. We talk about correlation rather than causation. So the correlates of that is going to be a set of neurons. You have to imagine you have this brain. It's the most complex system we know of in the known universe. It has 100 billion neurons, and probably only a small subset of those neurons are responsible for any one conscious state. So most of the time, most of the activity in your brain, you're unconscious of, and happily so. In fact, there are many parts of your, for instance, I don't know if you know, most of you, well, all of you, will have a brain down here. It's called the enteric nervous system. There are roughly 100 to 200 million nerve cells down here. And you have no idea what they do, and you don't want to know what they do. And very rarely you do know, when you feel nauseated, when you want to throw up. Or the other parts of your body, like the immune system, highly sophisticated system you're not conscious of. We have a part of the brain called the cerebellum here at the back. There's no evidence that we're conscious of activity in the cerebellum. So just because it's a complex collection of nerve cells doesn't mean you're conscious of. And probably you're only conscious of a very small part of it. And conversely, only a very small part of the nervous system at any given point in time is responsible for generating a particular conscious state. And that's a coalition of neurons, and you can bias those with attention, and they come together at a fraction of a second, then they fall apart. And of course, our job as scientists is to try to observe these coalitions. And since we don't know how to tag them, you have this you have this big brain of 100 billion neurons, and we have very crude tools. Either we have functional imaging, where we can just see large fraction of a brain light up at a very slow time scale, a very sluggish time scale, or we can put in individual pieces of metal wire in a head of a patient or in a head of an animal to observe 1 or 2 neurons in great detail. But what we really need to do, we need to be able to observe individual neurons, but hundreds of millions of them at the same time. And right now we don't have, our tools are very impoverished. So the great realization over the last 100 years is there are many, many brains inside your head. As it were, there are many automatic systems. Francis and I call them zombie systems for obvious reasons. That control your behavior, that either don't involve consciousness at all, or that only involve consciousness after the fact. So if you do things like Michael used to do for a living, if you're a professional biker, or you're a runner, or you play tennis, or you bike, or you drive, or you climb, or you dance, or you do all the other things that we love to do, particularly if you do it at an expert level, you do it effortlessly, unconsciously, mindlessly. You're just in the act. What happened there, you had to be exquisitely conscious while you trained up these systems. And then once you become conscious of them, you can dispense, a different part of the brain takes over, and you can do these things without thought. And that's a great boon, because you don't need to, because thinking, consciousness takes time. And so in a split second, when time really counts, it's disadvantaged to really think about them, to think about those things. And so there's lots of clinical evidence, there's lots of evidence from the lab in normal people and in animal studies that all sorts of things, including such mundane things as reaching out and grabbing something, moving your eyes. You move your eyes as often as your heart beats. Yet you're utterly by and large, 99.99% of the time, you're utterly unaware of the fact that you move your eyes or how you move your eyes. You don't have conscious access to that. So what we have to explain is the difference. Why are there so many things that don't require consciousness and a few things that do require consciousness? And where this allows us also to track where in the brain is the difference, right? We can look at using brain imaging or using other fancy tools. We can try to see where the parts of the brain that are necessary or that are involved in generating this unconscious behavior as compared to the parts of the brain that are necessary for generating conscious behavior. Are the neurons different? Do they look different? Do they go in a different mode? Are they in a different part of the brain? Those are all questions people ask. Here's a great quote from a very gem of the meditative literature I really like, written by a German who lived in Japan between the wars. And at the last chapter in this book on archery, it also talks about sword fighting. And he cites this, what a Zen master told him. The pupil must develop a new sense, or more accurately, a new alertness of all of his senses, which will enable him to avoid dangerous thrusts as though he could feel them coming. Once he's mastered the art of evasion, he no longer needs to watch with undivided attention the movements of his opponent, or even of several opponents at once. Rather, he sees and feels what is going to happen, and at that same moment, he's already avoided its effect without there being a hair's breadth between perceiving and avoiding. This, then, is what counts, a lightning reaction which has no further need of conscious observation. In this respect, at least, the pupil makes himself independent of all conscious purpose, and that's a great gain. And if you read many, many sports, if you read motivational literature, if you read books on, how to climb 512, if you do things like that, it's always being in the zone, not thinking, just being all mindless in the action. And so, you have to explain, we can do all these sophisticated things without consciousness. So one question is, why do you need consciousness at all? And B, as I mentioned already, where's the difference in the brain between conscious and unconscious action? You need consciousness because for all the things that you didn't plan for, we all know we live in Southern California. Suddenly there's an earthquake here. You really have to think, okay, it's the first time I've been here. Where's the exit? Where's everybody running towards? How can I get out of this building in safety? You've never planned that before. That's what you need consciousness for the unexpected things in life, the things that you haven't rehearsed over and over again. But I mean, this is all nice, making, speculating as people have done over the last 100 or 200 years, but ultimately has to come down to empirical things that you can test and prove and disprove, because that's how science works. So the experimental program that many people now throughout the world, many scientists adopt, is the following. So first of all, characterize the neural correlates of consciousness using all sorts of tools. Imaging tools, study them in normal people, study them in the clinic, study them in animal. If you want to study in animals, which ultimately you have to do if you really want to uncover the circuits responsible for consciousness, just like we want to uncover the molecules responsible for passing my information on to my descendants, we like to understand what are the specific circuit and what part of the brain that are involved for that. Obviously, you can't do that in humans, so you need to go to animal models, where you can also then allow you to move from correlation to causation. Ultimately, we want a final theory of consciousness, a scientific theory of consciousness. So what we want to be able to say, not just when I think of blue, these neurons are active, and when I smell mom's apple pie, these neurons are active, but I want to be able to say which system under what condition will have these things called subjective states. And is that restricted to biological creatures? Is it restricted to evolved creatures? Or can we also build artificial creatures? Is this wonderful thing, for example, a Macintosh? Is this thing, for example, conscious? Could it be conscious? And in what condition could it be conscious? That's sort of the dream of a final theory of consciousness. So in the meantime, we need to have something like a Turing test. We need to be able to say in subjects that don't necessarily talk, either because they're babies. How do we know that a very young newborn baby is actually conscious? We don't actually. What about, we saw Terry Schiavo, right, last month, tragic case, and there are 10,000 of people like that with what's called persistent vegetative syndrome, PVS, where we don't know whether they're conscious or not, or are they occasionally conscious, and so we need a test for those. And of course, we want to test for non-linguistic subjects like monkeys or like mice, or maybe even like bees, or like flies, or like C. elegans. We need to have some battery of behavioral tests that enable us to test if this species or this individual can pass these batteries of tests. Then, by these and these definitions, I assume that the subject is conscious. Okay, so let me tell you 3 little stories how you can test these things in the lab. So one is, can we have the lights off? And can we just dim the lights? Thank you. So just keep this a simple illusion. Just look at the star. Look at the cross. Don't move your eyes. Keep them open. Don't move your eyes and tell me what you see. Okay? You should all see a blue sphere. Do you? Yes? Yes? Okay, otherwise you should see me afterwards. Now, if you just keep your eyes fixed at the cause, you should also see something else. Okay, good audience. Okay, so the yellow square, it's a nice illusion discovered by these people here a couple of years ago. It's a nice illusion, it's called motion-induced blindness, and the point is sometimes you see the yellow and sometimes you don't. You got to trust me, I'm a scientist, I'm not cheating. I mean, the yellow squares are always present. In fact, you can find out yourself, because when it disappears for you, it may not disappear for your neighbor. So I give a lot of talks to philosophers these days, and they always ask me, of course, how do you define consciousness? And I can't really. It's like very often in an early phase of a scientific exploration of something, you can't really rigorously define it. But what I mean by consciousness is sometimes you see them. Then you can talk to your neighbor about the yellow. You have, it may remind you of, the yellow Van Gogh sunflowers or something. You're conscious of it. And sometimes you don't. It's just not present. You're not conscious of it. Where's the difference in the brain? It's a very simple question. Where's the difference in the brain when you see the yellow and when you don't see the yellow? Okay, second illusion. Just keep me happy and fixate. Keep your eyes fixed on the cause. Okay? I'm going to show you the oldest tool in psychology. It's called an after effect. It's around since several hundred years. And just while I talk, just don't move your eyes. Keep your eyes fixed on the cause. And sort of try to remember while you keep your eyes fixed, there's red in the upper left and there's green in the upper right. Sorry, the other way around. I just wanted to test you. Okay, so just keep your eyes fixed, and what do you see now? Quick, what do you see? Okay, so obviously it worked. So this disproves the simple, naive proposition that most of us have. Most of us, when we first think about consciousness, we think, well, it's pretty obvious. There's a world outside there, and there's a conscious mind inside my skull, and there's a very simple mapping between the outside world and the objective outside world, here I can measure, and the inside world that's only accessible to me. In this case, it's obviously not, because when you look after a while, what you see is really just a gray surface. But because of this, I adapted you. You looked at these different colors for half a minute. Your retina slightly changed. Therefore, you saw, for a couple of seconds, you saw these very vivid colors. Although physically they were not present. So in this case, at least, there's no simple dissociation. There's a simple dissociation between what's out in the world and what's inside your head. Now, if you remember this illusion I showed you, you can now ask the simple, do we have a laser pointer? Okay, I think it's coming. Thank you. Thank you, that was very quick. Okay, so we can now go back and ask the simple question, if you look at those yellows and I show you a gray screen afterwards, you should be able to see an after effect, just like before. It'll be faintly blue, and you get it. Now the question is, if you don't see it for the time that you didn't see the yellow, will you still get an after effect? So you can ask a question in the lab that seems totally nonsensical and stupid. Do you need to see something in order to get an after effect to it, okay? You need to see yellow in order to get the after effect for yellow, which is blue. Well, the clear and unambiguous answer is, which we did with a graduate student, no. You do not need to see the you do not need to see the yellow. So what we essentially tested is the strength of the after effect. Does it depend on the duration of suppression of yellow? So in other words, you look at all the cases where yellow was suppressed for 2 seconds, but where it was present on your eye, compared to when you saw it for 2 seconds. And you do that over many trials, over many subjects, and you see this clear and unambiguous answer. Whether or not you see it makes absolutely no difference to the after effect. So besides sort of being acute observation, why is that interesting? Well, it tells us something about the correlates of consciousness in the brain. It tells us that the correlates of consciousness for seeing color, for seeing after effects, has to come in the processing hierarchy after the stage where the after effect occurs. And the after effect is believed to occur by and large in the retina. So what this tells us, which is something we knew before, that you don't see with your eyes. You don't see with your retina. You need your retina in order to capture the photon, to translate them into an action potential that is then sent up this cable to the visual cortex at the back of your head, but you don't need the eyes in order, the neurons in the eyes do not generate conscious perception. That's done at a higher stage. So you can do this very simple demonstration. And you can also do more fancy version work, for example, other after effects, like you get an after effect, this is a little bit more technical, you get an after effect for gratings. This one also, you don't need to see the grating consciously in order to get the after effect. This one you do, however. This we did with a professor who's here, also at Caltech, Shin Shimojo. If you don't see a face, you don't get a face-specific after effect. So you can sort of, it helps you locate in the processing hierarchy of the brain where is visual consciousness. And it argues against the position that many people have, which is sort of a little bit mysterious, that people say, well, consciousness is a holistic property of the brain. It's a global holistic property of the brain. You can't associate with specific circuits. It's a little bit like people 100 years ago who said heredity, is associated with the entire organism, and there were many people like that. In fact, the majority of people around 1900 believed that heredity did not reside in anything as specific as a molecule because we didn't have any understanding of the amazing power of macromolecule to store information. And so we think, Francis and I always had this bias that it's going to be very similar. Consciousness, there are very specific circuits located in specific parts of the brain that are responsible for conscious sensation. Okay, let me show you a second experiment. This is called something change blindness. It's a fun little illusion where actually it's quite, science tells us how things are, whether we like them or not. So this tells us that when we think we see everything, right? I open my eyes, I of course see all of you clearly in front of me. I clearly see you. Well, what this shows you that very often you don't. So this is two pictures, and they're doctored. There's one thing that's different here. Now, don't call out what it is. Okay, please don't ruin it for your fellows, attendees. So just lift your hand if you see where the difference is. Okay, so there are about half of you. Do you see the difference? There. Do you want to meet? Do you know what the bad side of this is? The IQ is inversely correlated to the reaction time. It's a joke, it's a joke, it's a joke, it's a joke. It's not true as far as we know. Okay, this is a homegrown version. These are my 3 dogs at home. And, again, lift your hand when you see the finger, when you see the, no, consider fewer of you. It's very clear. Once you see it again, it's totally obvious. The carpet here, right? Okay, we can do another one. This is a little bit different. This is one that requires really all your attention. So I have to ask you to be very quiet, okay, and not make any noises. Particularly when you laugh, when you see it, it's going to ruin it for your neighbor. So just don't say anything. You really have to pay attention. This is an attention task. There are 2 sets of people here. There are 3 people in white shirts and 3 people you see the other here, and here in black shirts, and they have two basketballs, 1 each. And your task is to count how often the white people, the people in white t-shirt, pass the ball to each other. I see most of you saw it. How many people saw it? Oh, many of you didn't. Okay. So for those of you who didn't, I'm just going to replay this clip. It's quite dramatic. It's difficult to believe that your visual system is this bad. So just out of curiosity, how many people missed the gorilla? Okay. Okay, so this is called change blindness, and it should give us pause when we read about witnesses and testimonies, and in criminal trials, when people say, yes, of course, I saw the perpetrator, it was him or it was her. And very often, of course, these things, the moral here is that if things are unexpected, that here I pre-cued you and you had to pay attention to these people in white, and then totally unexpected, this gorilla walks across the stage. And very often your visual system misses these things just because you didn't attend to it. You did not attend to this event, and you didn't expect it. Therefore, you may totally miss it, although it's present for many seconds. This is a trick. This is a millennia-old trick. This is what magicians do, okay? You go to a magic show. You have a magician. He has a beautiful bikini-clad assistant, okay? She distracts you, and the magician makes things disappear in front of you that if you go to the same show 2 or 3 times and you're not distracted by her, you can perfectly well see. But with attentional manipulation, you may totally miss these things. So yet we have this feeling, we have this illusion, it turns out, that we see everything all the time. Now let's do it a little bit more boring because we're scientists after all, right? We have the rare personalities. So let's go on a magnet and let's do the scientific version of this. So what we ask you to do, we ask you to fixate here. Don't move your eyes, look at here, and you see the orientation of these rings will flip every 10 or 15 seconds. They move about, they flicker a little bit, but occasionally they'll flip by 90 degrees. And sometimes you'll see some of these changes, and sometimes you don't. So you always fixate here, and we check that with eye movements. And sometimes this, for example, flipped. And I think it's going to here, it just flipped. I don't know if you saw it. So it's a difficult task, and and so sometimes you see it, and you have buttons where you tell us, okay, I saw this flip, or I saw this flip. So we can now compare what happens in your brain. What we do, we put you in a magnetic scanner, and we sort of conceptually look at your brain. Okay, this is your eyes, this is the back of your head. You can feel it. There's a little bump here at the back of your head. You can all feel it. A little bit above the bump, like like maybe half an inch, is your visual cortex. So the output of your eyes, the optic nerve, goes to the back here, and then we can sort of analyze it in great detail. The different visual areas here called V1, the first visual area, and V2 and V3, et cetera, et cetera. So we can essentially look at your brain activity, and we can now it's very sluggish, as I mentioned before, because we're actually not looking at neurons, we're looking at the power consumption of neurons. So at this scale, you have time. At 0 second, the image flips. And here, this is 10, 20 seconds after the image flipped. And we ask, well, we look at now your activity in this first part of your brain, primary visual cortex, and we ask, what is the activity if you saw the change? So if you saw the change, it's called hit. So you get this increase in blood flow and then a decrease, corresponding to neurons firing, and then for some reason, people don't really understand, there is a reduction in blood flow. Okay. Much more surprising is the red one. The red one is when you thought there was a change, but there wasn't. You made a mistake. It was, for example, in a neighboring location, or there wasn't anything at all. You just got confused. Okay? So you thought there was a change. You believe erroneously was a change, but there wasn't a change. Well, your brain activity reflects what you actually thought there was. Also, it wasn't there. Okay? So in this case, in the very earliest part of the visual cortex already, you get something that reflects this subjective feeling, the subjective state, the visual consciousness, rather than the change in the physical signal. And conversely, when you missed it, so when there was a physical change there, but you didn't see it, you get this reduction in activity. And you can do this using, this is sort of the footprint of actually seeing the change. So here, what turns out very early on, you can to the surprise of lots of us, to a lot of visual scientists, including myself, you see already in the first part of the visual brain, if you're looking at hemodynamic, you're seeing something that reflects the subjective percept rather than the physical signal that comes in. So if you do this in experiment in the retina, you would only get physical change. The retina only cares about the physical input. It doesn't care about the subjective percept. But surprisingly, very early on, it changes already. The last study, which we do together with a neurosurgeon and a brilliant neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, Itzhak Fried at UCLA. So what he does, he implants people with microelectrodes. These are epileptic patients that the drugs don't work anymore. And so then what they do, it's a very successful operation. They go inside, they go to a neurosurgeon, and the neurosurgeon takes out the part of the brain that gives rise to the seizure. In many patients, you can look from the outside using MRI or CT scan. You can locate, you can pinpoint where the part of the brain is from which the seizure originates. You can't do that in many patients. So then what you have to do, what Itzhak Fried does, he inserts these microelectrodes into the brain. So you have 12 of these microelectrodes inside the brain now. And they're left there they're left inside the brain for 3 or 5 or 6 days. The patient moves around the hospital, sleeps there and watches TV, talks to his parents, etc., for as long as it takes for him to have 3 to 5 seizures. And then the patient is monitored 24/7 with these big electrodes here from these metal leads. And so you can essentially monitor, you can do, it's like EEG, but doing it inside the brain. And then you can pinpoint where the foci is. You take out the electrode, and you take out the part of the brain. Okay, it's a very successful operation. Now, what these patients are willing to do, because of course we have to get their permission, is that what Fried does, he hollows out the volume of these and inserts tiny wires. So now, in addition to having these big electrodes, you can see it on the MRI, there are these tiny wires that go to the end here, which allow us to do something. It's a fantastic opportunity that we have grace of these patients, because it allows us to do what we can otherwise only do in animals. We can now listen in to individual neurons chatting away, talking to each other using the action potential code that we can decode in a living conscious person, where we can directly ask, are you conscious of this, or are you not conscious of that? So here, for example, you have a patient, sits there, you have a turbine, you have these electrodes there, and then the wires go to a bed stand, and there we have a computer for recording it all and analyzing it. So we have a paper coming out next couple of weeks from now about this, describing this in great detail. So this is some old data I'm showing in the meantime. So here this is the only technical graph I have. This shows time. Now this is the relevant time scale for consciousness. It's not seconds, it's fraction of a second. So the time between those two vertical ticks is 1 second. So this total thing is 3 seconds long. And this, the x-axis, shows the activity. Here we show the individual action potential. So neurons, you may know, talk to each other using individual pulses. You can put them on an audio monitor. You can actually listen to them. And so here you show, when we show this patient, this fractal pattern, the neuron doesn't respond. This is before the image. We put the image on at this time, leave it on for 1 second, then we remove the image. The patient doesn't respond, the neuron doesn't respond to this picture, or hardly, a little blip here. But if we put up this picture, this photograph, the neuron fires very strongly. We put up another picture of Bill Clinton and his wife, and somebody else fires very strongly. We put up a line drawing of Bill Clinton, fires very strongly. Doesn't respond to other famous males. Didn't respond to President Bush. This was done 6 years ago. Doesn't respond to other famous male. We have other neurons here that respond to the Beatles. Neuron here that responds to Simpson. We now have a whole collection of neurons that respond to, for example, Jennifer Aniston or Terry, to famous people. It responds to famous people because that's the subject material we use to test. We know there are neurons that respond to things that you're very familiar with, like your mother, your loved ones, the people you're at work, and of course, and celebrities. So we show, this being LA, we show lots of celebrities, and by and large, we find individual neurons that respond selectively to individual celebrities. Like here, you can see that we have these neurons from Fried's lab that respond to this particular celebrity. We can now also ask the question, what about imagery? What about if you close your eyes? Okay, close your eyes and remember back, for example, the picture I showed you of my 3 dogs. You can perfectly well remember that picture, right? And most of us can have visual images. So now, again, we can directly test. Because this you can't do in an animal, right? Because you can't ask them, close your eyes and imagine something. So now, for example, here we have a neuron that responds to a picture of the Beatle, Paul McCartney. So every time we show the picture for 1 second, you get this action potential. When we show, for example, the picture of this house, the neuron doesn't respond, or responds only very weakly, but it responds quite nicely to the picture of McCartney. Here we ask now the patient for 3 seconds, close your eyes. We do it for 3 seconds because it takes some time to paint this mental picture. Think of the picture of, remember Paul McCartney, think about Paul McCartney, think about the house, think about McCartney, and you can see whenever the patient is being asked to think of McCartney, the neuron fires much stronger than if the patient is being asked to think about the house. So you get the same selectivity. So we can now do a lot of studies of consciousness where we can manipulate what's out there and what's inside the head while monitoring the neurons. So the long-term strategy is to study the neural basis of consciousness in animals. I haven't talked about that today. There's no time. On humans. What you ultimately want to identify, you want to identify the specific neurons. And then the big step we need to do, we need to move to causation. We got to go away from just observing, okay, this correlates with that. Because, we want to establish a final science of consciousness. So there, in humans, we can do certain things like we can do neuroprosthetic devices. It's done, for example, here at Caltech by Richard Anderson, where you can implant electrodes inside the brain for the patient. For example, when you're in a locked-in syndrome or you have a paralyzed patient, you can read out their thoughts. You can do what's something called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is not to be confused with the people who levitate, where you stimulate parts of their brain. But this is all very crude. What you really want to do, we need to be able to interfere delicately, deliberately, transiently, reversibly in the brain, and that we can only do in animals. Lastly, people tell me, well, this is all very fine, and we believe you. At some point you'll know, you'll understand the correlates, but you're forever going to miss something. Why? Well, because we know that you can, that consciousness can't be explained by anything in the physical universe. And of course, it's a very, very common objection. Now, I found this wonderful quote. Well, this is my last slide. Let me just put it in context. So there's some analogy. It's an analogy, and so it's not perfect. But the problem of consciousness has an analogy with the problem of origin of life and heredity. So in the turn of last century, 1900, 1910, 1880, 1890, people had grave conceptual difficulty imagining how mere chemistry that people thought they understood, how mere chemistry that's present in a single cell could possibly explain the specificity of genetic information that's passed on from one generation to the next. And so people made all sorts of hypotheses like élan vital, Bergson, vitalism. They had all sorts of explanations how you could do it. And what they missed was just a detailed understanding of the molecular machinery. They just didn't have that at the time. And this is perfectly captured in this quote. Bateson was the preeminent geneticist in England. He reviewed in 1916 the book of Thomas Hunt Morgan, who at the time was at Columbia before he became chairman here at Caltech. And he was the person who established the fly as a molecular model. And he is also the person in this book, he describes that genetic information stored along one-dimensional strings, which we now know to be true. It's a genetic code, right? Stored along a one-dimensional string. Of course, he didn't know anything about the molecular basis. And so Bateson, who was a materialist, writes this: the properties of living things are in some way attached to a material basis, perhaps in some special degree to nuclear chromatin, the chromosomes. We know that's true now. And yet it is inconceivable. It is inconceivable that particles of chromatin or of any other substance, however complex, can possess those powers which must be assigned to our factors or genes. It's his spelling. The supposition that particles of chromatin, i.e. chromosomes, indistinguishable from each other, and indeed almost, that's of course the killer word, almost homogeneous. Of course, they're not homogeneous. Almost homogeneous under any known test can by their material nature confer all the properties of life, surpasses the range of even the most convinced materialism. So we should not make the same mistake twice and come to the same conclusion that just because right now we don't really understand it, we need to call for new laws of physics, or let alone new other entities. Thank you very much.
Outstanding. Very
We'll do it later.
It's all right. We'll take care of it later. Outstanding. That was a 2-hour lecture in 30 minutes. Very good. I forgot to mention that Christoph's also a rock climber. He's going to be doing Baxter Lecture Hall up the side at lunch. It's probably not allowed. Christoph's comments about philosophers reminds me of the story of the young philosopher giving his first talk at a conference amongst his elder colleagues and respected mentors, and he was saying something about how 2 negatives make a positive, but 2 positives don't make a negative. And out of the crowd came, yeah. Our next speaker I met at Steve Martin's house, of all places. Alison Gottmik and I belong to this sort of informal little, it's called a philosophy society or group or whatever it's called, but it's really a bunch of scientists mostly that just hang around once a year, a couple times a year at people's houses and just talk about interesting things. So this is where I met her, and she gave this interesting presentation. Everybody gives just a little 5 or 10 minute blip. Alison is really one of the world's leading researchers on the subject of how brains develop and grow in the sense of children developing the sense of thinking, understanding, causality, critical thinking, science, really. I mean, it's really how to train a kid to become a scientist in a way is what she does. She studies, at UC Berkeley, she studies cognitive development in her lab, research on cognition, brain and behavior, theory of mind, psychology and philosophy, how children develop and change intuitive theories, of the world, much the same way that scientists do, and some ways that they don't. Children's causal knowledge and causal learning across domains, including physical, biological, and psychological knowledge. In essence, how the brain learns to think. She's an international leader in the field of children's learning and was one of the first cognitive scientists to show how developmental psychology could be used to answer some ancient philosophical problems. She's a co-author of the book Words, Thoughts, and Theories, and the book that we have here, because it's a terrific book, The Scientist in the Crib, Minds, Brains, and How Children Learn. With that, please help me welcome Dr. Alison Gopnik.
I was going to ask if I can get this. Is this working? Yes? Great. Now, is it going to wake up? There we go. Great. Okay, first of all, many thanks to Michael for inviting me and to all of you for being here. I guess I'll have to be here to click this. I study brains, but I study them actually in living, moving, breathing children. And what I'm going to do today is talk about some research and some ideas that we've had about how studying children in particular can help us to understand how science works, how thinking about science can help us to understand how children work, and about how thinking about both science and children can help us to understand deep things about how human beings work, even some things about how our consciousness works. And all the work I'm going to talk about today is in collaboration with my brilliant student Laura Schultz, who's now at MIT, and in fact with a philosopher who really studies science and pays attention to it and changes his mind as a result, Clark Gleamore at Carnegie Mellon University. Okay, so it might seem very bizarre to think about children and scientists in the same breath. If you had asked people even 30 years ago about children, let alone a couple of hundred years ago, what you would have heard, the old story, was that babies and young children in particular are, as the great philosopher John Locke said, blank slates. They live in a blooming, buzzing confusion, as the great psychologist William James said. And even the great founder of developmental psychology, Jean Piaget, thought that babies and young children were egocentric and irrational and pre-causal. So they weren't actually capable of thinking rationally, figuring out what was going on around them in a systematic kind of way. And as I say, 30 years ago, that was the common wisdom about babies and young children. People even said that babies were decorticate. They were sort of like crying carrots, vegetables that could not do very much more than make a lot of noise. So you might think, well, what on earth could those creatures, and even 3- and 4-year-olds people thought were just these kind of fuzzy-headed, imaginative, creative, but incapable of, but deeply, deeply irrational creatures. You might think, what on earth could those kinds of creatures tell you about science or thought? Well, the last 30 years have completely overturned our views about babies and young children. It turns out that literally newborn babies, even the very, very youngest children, already think about the world, understand about the world, have abstract pictures of what the world is like. And even very young children already, like scientists, are figuring things out about the world. They have theories about the world. They test those theories. They do experiments. They change the theories in the light of what they find out about the world. So we've really completely changed over the last 30 years our view about what babies and young children are like. And every study that we do, every year, every week, there's some new finding that shows us that babies know much more and learn much more than we ever would have thought was possible. So I've called this new view about babies the theory, because the idea is that babies and young children are actually making up theories about the world in very much the same way that scientists make up theories about the world. And over the last 30 years, we've traced the way that babies and young children make up theories about the physical world around them. They learn about things like gravity and support and the physical relationships among objects. They make up theories about biology. Even 3- and 4-year-olds are starting to understand things about genetics, about the idea that traits can be inherited, that things can grow, that things can get sick. And importantly, they make up theories about other people's minds. So a lot of my earlier work was on what's called theory of mind or folk psychology, where even 2-year-olds, 18-month-olds, 10-month-olds are starting to make up theories about how other people's minds work. Now, so that's a quick summary of 30 years of research in cognitive development. But of course, it's very puzzling, right? I mean, why would it be that these very small children would apparently have such incredible intellectual capacities? Why is it that they would be making up these theories and showing these really phenomenal abilities to make inferences, create theories from what they see about the world? And I want to suggest what I'll call an evolutionary not-so-just-so story. There are a lot of evolutionary just-so stories out there. I'm extremely pleased to see that Roger Bingham has been cured of his susceptibility to them. But one of the things, what makes something not be just a just-so story? Well, one thing is if you can look across lots and lots of different species and see the same pattern. So it's not just something where you say, well, human beings are like this, so they must have evolved to be like this, but a case where you can actually see similar patterns of evolution across many, many different species. So here's the particular evolutionary just-so story, or not-so-just-so story, that I want to talk about. If you look across many, many different kinds of species of animals, look at different kinds of birds, different kinds of rodents, different kinds of mammals, you see a very interesting pattern. Some species within a general group seem to be more flexible, capable of learning more, able to exist in more different environments than others, what we anthropocentrically perhaps would call the smarter species. So ravens, which I'm just starting to study, are very, very smart birds. Rats are very smart rodents. Chimps and monkeys are very smart mammals, and so forth. And if you look at those members of those families and compare them to other species, you see that some other kinds of things seem to go along with that greater degree of intelligence. It turns out that the more intelligent species also are more likely to eat lots of different kinds of food. They're more likely to be polygamous. They're more likely to engage in a range of sexual behaviors. And their babies are likely to be immature for substantially longer than the babies of related but less intelligent species. Now, why is it that all those things, passing quickly over polygamy, would go together? And if you think, of course, about human beings, again, passing quickly over polygamy, we're way out on the end of the spectrum on all of those dimensions. So we're smarter, we're more flexible, we live in more different environments, we eat more different kinds of food, we have sex more different kinds of ways. And our babies, let me tell you as a mother of a 26-year-old, are immature and dependent on us for much longer than the babies of any other species. As I also point out, of course, at Berkeley, where I come from, we're even further out on the distribution on all of these measures than people in other places, even Southern California. Now, why would that be? Why would we see this correlation between being smart and being immature? Well, if you think about it for a minute, you can see why it might be. Some animals seem to have an evolutionary strategy of having instincts that are beautifully adapted for particular niches. Those are the kind of evolutionary psychology animals. But other species, like us, seem to have a different evolutionary strategy. We're designed not to be very good at doing anything in particular, but to be extremely good at learning about whatever environment it is that you put us in. And if you think that that's our evolutionary strategy, it's a great strategy. It's the strategy that's allowed us to conquer the world and even go into outer space. But it has one big disadvantage, which is that while the charging mastodon is coming towards you, you don't really want to be sitting there thinking, what is this? A mastodon? Does it charge? What am I supposed to do about it? And the way that nature seems, so you don't want to actually have to be learning and applying what you learn at the same time. And the way that nature seems to have solved that problem is by inventing babies. So babies and young children are people who don't have to do anything. Everything that they actually have to do is done by us. We're the ones who actually fend off the charging mastodons and find the peanut butter sandwiches and do all the things that they need for survival. All babies and young children have to do is learn. So the idea is that we have this period of protected immaturity where we don't have to do anything in particular, but we do have to learn everything about the world around us. And once we've used that period of childhood to learn all the things that we need to learn, then when we become adults, we can actually put all that learning to use to do all the boring things that we have to do to survive and reproduce. Well, maybe not that boring, but... So that's the picture. The picture is that babies and young children are essentially the R&D unit of the human species, right? We have to do the marketing and the selling and the manufacturing. They're the blue sky types who can just sit and figure out wonderful new ideas about how things should work. And if you think about the babies as being the R&D unit, then it's not perhaps so surprising that they should empirically turn out to have these incredible capacities for learning about the world around them. It makes a lot of sense that they're really designed, more than anything else, to make up theories, to figure out what the particular environment in which they find themselves is like. And in fact, we've suggested that this helps to explain another very puzzling thing, which is, why is it that human beings should have the capacity for science at all? I mean, we've only been using it in a systematic way for the last 400 years or so. And as Michael, I'm sure, can testify, it sometimes seems like most of us don't use this capacity at all. So why would it be? I mean, after all, even the greatest scientists have brains just like the rest of us. Why would our brains have evolved to do something that we seem to do only so recently and even so infrequently? And what we've suggested is that those capacities didn't develop for us to do science, they developed for us to be children. So the picture is not that children are little scientists, it's that scientists are big children. A few of us, when we're put in the same privileged position as babies, namely that we have nothing to do and we're taken care of and indulged and get to just play all the time, until very recently also had women who took care of all of our everyday needs. When we're put in that same position that babies are, we're actually capable of using some of these capacities that babies just automatically use all the time. And what we call science is the use in adults of these capacities for learning, for theory formation, for understanding the world, that were, from an evolutionary perspective, designed for children. So the view here is that science is a kind of epiphenomena of childhood. By the way, I've often talked about this with philosophers of science and so forth, and one of them called it the thesis that defies credulity. So they don't think very much about it. But I've also given this talk to scientists, to people at the Fermi labs and at the Lawrence labs, and they think that this is transparently obvious. So as soon as I say the thing about scientists being children, they all laugh and applaud and completely agree. Okay. If that hypothesis is correct, that in fact, in science, what we're doing is using these mechanisms, and if it's also, the theory is correct, that what children are doing is using some of the same mechanisms that we see in science, that's a nice first start. But of course, what we really would like to know is, okay, so what are those mechanisms? If what children are doing is like what scientists are doing and vice versa, exactly what is it that our brains are doing? Exactly what kinds of computations are we performing that let us do the kinds of things that we see in science and childhood? What kinds of computations, what kind of a computer inside of our brain could actually accomplish the things, the kinds of learning that we see all the time in children and sometimes in science? So the question is, how does science work from a computational perspective? And if you had asked philosophers of science that question, indeed if you did when you were, say, a young philosophy graduate student, as I was 30 years ago, they would have said, well, we don't really have any idea. You'll have to ask the psychologists. It's something, I don't know, there's powerful ones, there's not powerful ones, there's paradigm shifts, something happens to make science work, but we don't really know very much about it. Fortunately, in the past 15 years or so, there's been tremendous work in the philosophy of science, in statistics and computer science, which is actually telling us something about how science might work. And the basic idea is that you could think about science as a system for recovering the causal structure of the world, figuring out what the causal structure of the world is like, figuring out how some things make other things happen. Science does other things as well, but that's at least one very central thing that it does. And in terms of what Christophe was saying, you could think about it as being kind of like our visual system. Our visual system is designed to figure out the spatial structure of the world. There's a world out there, it's got 3 dimensions, it's got objects, and somehow our visual system has to take the information in our retina and reconstruct the spatial structure of the world. That's what we do when we look at the world. Well, you could think of science as being a similar kind of process, but a process that instead of uncovering the spatial structure of the world, instead of figuring out where things are, figures out how things work, figures out what out in the world causes something else, what makes other things happen. And often, what are the invisible things, the things we can't even see, that are making all sorts of other things happen. That's really what science is all about. So that's the suggestion that I'm going to make. That's the deep cognitive basis of science. And that's what little children are doing from the time they're born. That's what they care about more than anything else. Figuring out how things, people, objects, animals work. How do we do that? Well, there's 2 things that we do. One thing that we do is we actually do experiments. So we make interventions in the world, we do things in the world, and then we see what the consequences of those things are. What are the events going to be that will follow on our interventions on the world? And the other thing that we do is we do statistics. So what we do is we make those interventions, we see what happens, and then we look at the complicated patterns of dependence and independence among the events that follow from our interventions. So it isn't enough just to do experiments. That's a good thing to do. What you really need to do, though, is to know whether what came out of your experiment really is telling you something about causal structure, or if it's just telling you about coincidences or correlations. And it's that combination of being able to do experiments and to do statistical analyses of the dependencies among events. Those 2 things together give us the great power of science to figure out the causal structure of the world. So you could think of us as scientists. What we do is we do experiments, we look at what happens when we intervene on the world, we analyze the dependencies among events, and lo and behold, we figure out something about what causes what. And then we can use that information to send rockets to the moon and find a cure for AIDS and all the other great things that we do as scientists. What's happened over the last 15 years, as I say, is that people in philosophy of science, in computer science, and statistics have started actually giving a formal computational account of how those kinds of inferences are possible. How we could get from evidence of experiments and interventions and statistical evidence about the dependencies of events to normatively, accurately, veridically uncover the causal structure of the world. Just like we can take the information at our retina and normatively, veridically, accurately uncover the spatial structure of the world. And we're starting to figure out computationally how we can actually design systems that can do this. And my favorite, the systems are called causal Bayes nets, and my favorite application is that one of them is actually, a system like this is actually going up with the Mars robots in, I guess, 2012, which is the next robot. And what it's going to do is actually allow those little robots to actually do the science right up there on Mars and send us back the scientific conclusions instead of having to send us back the evidence. Now, what does all this have to do with children? Well, you think about those Mars robots. They're an awful lot like toddlers, right? Basically, they toddle around. They're always getting into things. The people on Earth are always having to pick them up again and fix them and take care of them and put Band-Aids on them. What we want to suggest is that actually toddlers are that kind of robot. What we want to suggest is that babies and young children are designed by evolution to be these fantastic, fabulous causal inference mechanisms. They're little engines, little machines that are designed to go around the world and figure out the causal structure of the world. That's what they're there for. And if that's true, they might be using some of the same kinds of computations as these robotic systems and that we implicitly use when we're doing science. They might actually be doing experiments and doing statistical analyses of those experiments to find out the truth. Now, how can we find out whether this is true? Well, we're talking about 3- and 4-year-olds here, so we can't actually ask them whether they understand experimental design or whether they can analyze statistics. But what we can do is we can do something a bit like Christophe's perceptual illusions. What we can do is we can actually give them new causal problems to solve. we can sort of put them on Mars, say, okay, I want you to figure this out. And we can give them different kinds of patterns of evidence about those problems, and we can see what conclusions they draw. And that's what we've been doing in my lab for the last five years or so. Let me give you an example of how this is possible. Suppose, for instance, I show you a machine like this. When we do this with the babies, you'll see in a minute, it's actually a square box, and it has two little gears on the top, and it has a switch, right? Looks very simple. Here's what happens. I flick the switch, and the gears spin together. And then I flick the switch back, and they stop. I flick the switch again, and they spin together, and I switch it off, and they stop. Now, that might seem like that's such an incredibly simple system. What's there to find out about? Well, actually, even that incredibly simple machine turns out to have lots of causal possibilities. So it could be that the switch is making the yellow wheel spin, which is making the blue wheel spin. Or it could be the switch is making the blue wheel spin, which is making the yellow wheel spin. Or it could be the switch makes them both spin independently. Or it could even be that you need both of them to spin, that the switch plus one gear makes the other spin, and the switch plus the other gear makes the blue one spin. So even with this simple system, there's lots of causal possibilities. How could you figure out which one of these is right? If you're a little causal inference engine, you want to try and figure out what the truth is about this machine. So here's something you could do. You can't do it just by looking at the wheels spin. But what you could do is you could take off the blue wheel and now flick the switch and see what happens to the yellow wheel. And then, sorry, this is missing a little piece. And then what you could do is do the opposite. What you could do is you could take off the blue wheel and see what happens, take off the yellow wheel and see what happens when you spin the blue wheel. So in this case, what happens is you take off the blue wheel and the yellow wheel spins, and you take off the yellow wheel and the blue wheel does not spin. Okay, everybody got that? Well, that pattern of evidence can actually tell you what the right answer is. So if you see that pattern of evidence, you know that the structure has to be that the switch made the yellow wheel spin, which made the blue wheel spin, right? So if you take off the blue wheel and the yellow wheel spins, but you take off the yellow wheel and the blue wheel doesn't spin, then formally it has to be that second pattern. So there's a kind of causal logic that's involved here. So what we know is that looking at these complicated patterns about what happens when we intervene, looking at this kind of statistics of the results of our experiment can tell us the causal structure of this machine. Okay, so the question is, all right, I hope, an audience full of brilliant, scientifically sophisticated people like this can solve this kind of problem. But could very young children who've never done a science experiment in their life also solve this problem? Can they use statistics and experiments to figure out the structure of causal events? What we did was do exactly what we just did with you, except do it with a bunch of 4-year-olds. There's some details about this, but that I won't go into. But essentially what we did was we showed the children different patterns of evidence, the patterns of evidence that I showed you before. And then we simply gave them those little pictures that you just saw, and we said, tell us, how does the machine work? Is it yellow, the switch making yellow go, which is making blue go, or is it both, or whatever? Just show me the picture that says how this machine works. And what we discovered was that the children, these are 4-year-olds, were incredibly good at solving this problem. In fact, they were all systematically on all of these patterns. If you gave them the right pattern of evidence, they would draw the right conclusion about the causal structure. Moreover, we could do it the other way around. So we could actually get them to predict. If we showed them the picture and we said, look, this is how it works, what will happen if I do this experiment? What will happen if I take the blue one off and flick the switch? Will the yellow one go or will the yellow one not go? Again, even very young children, even these 4-year-olds, were extremely good at making these kinds of predictions. So conclusions, even very young children, even 4-year-olds, were using patterns of experimental intervention and statistics in a very, very sophisticated way. Remember, these are kids who are not reading yet, in a very, very sophisticated way, but a practical way to try and solve these causal problems. Now, of course, you might say, well, that's true, but after all, we were doing the experiments. It wasn't that they were doing the experiments. We were doing the experiments and then trying to see what kinds of conclusions they would draw. And by the way, everything I've shown you is exactly what's predicted by the formal computational account of causal inference that I talked about before. Could children actually discover some of these things themselves if they didn't have us developmental psychologists asking them the questions? And to try to do that, what we did was we simply gave the children the box. And we said, OK, figure out how this works. Now, we should emphasize that children, as you'll see, are not exactly controlled experimenters. So let's, oops. Let me show you what they actually did, I hope. Yes. I think this is the largest these children have ever been, so I hope you can hear it. So here's some of the things that they did. Okay, as Laura Schultz, who did these experiments, always said, you wouldn't be laughing like this if this was your thesis data. So what it shows you is that children very spontaneously, and we could just show these kinds of films for hours, as soon as they get this kind of problem, are trying to do all these things to figure it out, many of which are completely useless and aren't going to help. But in addition to doing those things, here's something else that the children did. I hope. Wow, he says. And he says, I wonder how. And he says, the crank's over here, and actually solves the problem at the end. And what we've discovered is that we've now done this, at the time of this slide, we had done this, with 9 children. We've now done this with 20 children. Out of 20 pairs of children, 19 of them, in the space of 4 minutes, figured out the answer to this problem. And they did that just as a result of their kind of spontaneous interventions. A little thing that I wanted to say is that we often, in terms of neuroscience, people often talk about babies and young children as being sort of defective grown-ups. So they often point out that the children don't have a developed frontal lobe. My teenage son points this out many, many times, which means that they're not as capable of control and of inhibition and so forth as adults are. But if you think about this kind of task, that lack of control and inhibition may be beautifully designed for children to actually be great causal inference engines. The fact that the children get into everything, the fact that they can't see something without trying every possible kind of intervention, without trying every experiment that you can imagine, the fact that they do it over and over and over again and you can't get them away from it, that may be a very bad thing for a grown-up to do. But it may be exactly what you want a Mars rover to do. You want your Mars rovers to get into everything. And that's exactly what these children seem to be, doing. And they seem to be using that getting into everything to teach them fundamental things about the causal structure of the world. Okay, I want to just say a few last things about consciousness, which is part of what we're supposed to be talking about here. People have often suggested that babies and even young children aren't really conscious the way that the rest of us are. I want you to think about the looks on the faces of those children that you've just seen in those videos. And I want to suggest, having spent a lot of time looking at the faces of those young children, I want to suggest just the opposite. I want to suggest that children and babies are actually more conscious than we are, more vividly aware of what's going on around them. And I want to suggest this for 3 reasons. what we see, and what I hope I've given you some evidence for, is that there's a kind of functional trade-off for human beings with development. So early in our development, as young children, we seem to be incredibly well designed to learn new things. That's really what we're all about, is about learning new things. We're incredibly bad at actually using our knowledge to do anything. So children can learn 3 languages at once, but they can't tie their shoelaces. They're really, really bad at putting their knowledge to work efficiently and smoothly and automatically the way we adults can. As adults, we're very good at doing things, as Christoph mentioned, really well and expertly and quickly and automatically. We're much less good at being flexible. We're much less good at learning how to do things in a new way. And there's even some neurological evidence for this. So from a neurological perspective, we see these brains that to begin with have potential for massive numbers of connections. And then what happens is the connections that work well get reinforced and the connections that don't disappear. So we have this kind of neurological trade-off between an early brain that's incredibly plastic but not very efficient, and then a developed brain that's very efficient but not very plastic, not very flexible and not as good at learning. So what I want to suggest is that in adults at least, that goes with a kind of phenomenological trade-off. If you think about the experiences that we have as adults that are the most vivid, the ones where we're most aware, it's when we do things like fall in love with someone new or go to a new city that we've never been to before. You go to a new city, especially go to a new city and fall in love, and you'll suddenly find yourself being a baby again, right? You wake up in the middle of the night not being able to sleep and crying, and everything around you seems to have this texture, this vividness, this kind of deep consciousness that you never have when you're just in ordinary life. As an adult, the more automatic, the more efficient, the more straightforward things become, as Christoph also mentioned, the less aware we are of them. The more they just become part of our background knowledge, the less vivid and aware we are of what's going on around us. So I think that actually for babies and young children, every day is first love in Paris. They're constantly in this state of vivid, conscious, determined, focused, attentive awareness that we as adults can only manage on special occasions. But what I want to end with is to say that, so my conclusion about all this is that, yes, they really are scientists, but what I also want to say is that the fact that children are scientists and scientists are children means that science isn't just this specialized thing that a few people do in beautiful places like Caltech. Science is a deep, deep fundamental part of what it is to be human. And those great conscious experiences, that first love in Paris that you could see on the faces of those children chosen at random trying to figure out the gear toy, that consciousness is also the special gift that we have when we do science.
Excellent, very good, thank you. So we're going to do the panel now, so we'll just move you over here.
Just a couple of comments there. I'm remembering from a sequence in the Human Quest, which of course I won't try and show you, that I actually did a thing called the Turing test that Christoph mentioned, which is you're put behind a screen and at the other side is either a human being or a computer. All you get is typescript coming out at you. And you have to figure out whether you're talking to a human being or a computer. And I remember very clearly that I got right all of the computers. I've figured them all out, but I actually assigned 2 human beings to being computers. So it's actually kind of difficult to do. You were talking, Christoph, let me just start with this, and Michael, you'll have a comment on it as well. You were talking earlier about being in the flow of things. You were talking about the Eugen Herrigel quote and so on. Have either of you read Malcolm Gladwell's new book, Blink? All right, so a lot of you would know about this notion of fast cognition and thin slicing and so on. It seems to me a little bit of a not entirely correct. There are some, the idea is that your intuition, your fast cognition works so rapidly, and in the case of identifying whether the Kouros was a mistake or not and so on, some of you know this story. But on the other hand, you plainly need experience, an experienced database to be able to make some of the more complicated decisions. How do you strike that balance? So can you talk about that? Because this actually all 3 of you, because you're also talking about a child's experience to novelty when it doesn't have a huge database, it doesn't have a massive representations that it has to wrestle with. But later in life, it has all this vast stock.
When you're in the flow, your mind is left free to ponder long-term things, to ponder more long-term issues. So when you're giving a talk, I'm very aware of this, every time you give a talk, or when you're just having an intense conversation with somebody, it's not that you're thinking, okay, this is the next sentence I'm going to say, and I'm going to say it to myself in German because I'm German, and then I'm going to, this is a verb, and well, this is the beginning, and then 200 words later it's a verb, and then I'm going to send it to my English translator, and then next thing I send it off to my Larynx. It's nothing like it, right? I have a very vague idea what I'm going to say now to you in the next 5 seconds. The next thing I hear these words come tumbling out of my mouth. So that's. No, so that's one of these examples, because I've given you hundreds of talks on this topic. It's zombie system, but my mind in the meantime is left free sort of to ponder, there was this other point that Roger made, and that I have to still answer. So it's not that I'm unconscious, but I'm by and large totally unconscious of the things I'm actually doing right there at the moment.
Alison?
Well, this comes up again in an interesting way if you're thinking about the children in our experiments, because of course exactly what they're not doing is they're not sitting there and saying, oh, well, that one was statistically independent of this other one, so it must be that it's that causal structure rather than another. There's a lovely quote from actually the philosopher Jerry Fodor when someone asked what the stream of consciousness was when he was doing his work, and he said, mostly it's, you can do it, Jerry. Come on, Jerry. Go at it, Jerry. And I actually think that may be very true as far as the children are concerned. I think most of the stream of consciousness that's going on with them is, oh, tough, hard, and then, aha, got it. And you can watch that happening on their faces. So I think what may happen is there's a funny balance between the stream of the things that we're actually conscious about are more of these sort of points of, am I going in the right direction? Is this going to yield results? Is this is actually the right kind of match, rather than having what we think of as, say, a scientific stream of consciousness where we think there's a whole bunch of sentences that we're working out. And I think it would be quite interesting to try and work that out more.
Michael?
I'm fond of saying that science doesn't come naturally in the sense of control group, experimental group.
Right.
Anecdotal thinking comes naturally, connecting A to B. We're pattern-seeking primates and all that stuff. So, Aunt Mary's cancer went away after she had extractive seaweed. I better try it too. That seems like a natural way that we evolved to connect A to B. And often at times A was connected to B really, so we survived. How do you train adults to be like kids in causal inference for things like A is not connected to B? Right. Superstitious thinking.
What about, just one other point, when you were talking about the children have this very supportive environment, a lot of parental investment, they're just sitting there learning causality, learning the world so that they can then navigate through biological marketplaces and so on and so forth. It almost seemed as though you were making a claim that was a kind of a definition of intelligence. And one wonders, you can obviously take a child who's being at a magnet school, being totally supported and so on, but you can also imagine a kid who's having to navigate through in a really tough biological marketplace, say the streets of Delhi or something. This is a sort of artful dodger hypothesis, which has got a very fast, very, very good cognition, but has none of the normal support. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah. So
it's a very highly individualized,
right.
what I'm saying.
So Michael's question is what I think of as if babies are so stupid, how come we're so, if babies are so smart, how come we're so stupid question, right? Which is a question that always comes up. Yeah. One reason is because we're stupider. I mean, so if you look at it from a neurological perspective, I think we just are stupider than children are. But I think a more sort of optimistic point is if you think about the kinds of problems those children are solving, if we did that problem as a paper and pencil problem, or we simply told them about it, we wouldn't get those results. We've tried it. Even if we do it on a computer screen, the way I did it with you, we don't get those results. So we get it if it's a real problem. The children can do real interventions. It's easy for them to do interventions. When they have a hypothesis, they can test it a second afterwards. That's the circumstance in which we see this incredible causal inference. And of course, the problem is that for lots of things that are really important to us, like medicine, like whether we're going to get sick or not, a lot of the things that we do in science, none of those things are true. We can't just give grandma the extractive seaweed 3 seconds later and see whether she gets better or not. And my guess is if you actually could have the circumstance where you could actually do the right interventions and experiments right on the spot, easily, without a big investment of time and energy, and you got the right pattern of results, then I think people would not make these kinds of mistakes. So I think the thing is that children are not consciously knowing. There's a difference between sitting there. The problem for us scientists is we have to design the right experiments consciously and decide what the consequences of them are. The children are just getting bombarded with information all the time, and just their restlessness and their getting into everythingness and their lack of a frontal lobe means that for the problems that they're trying to solve, they're just getting evidence constantly. And I think that's the things that where we see the most superstition and the most irrationality in adults, which are exactly things like medicine, are cases where it's very important and we don't have very much evidence and we don't have simple ways of getting a lot of evidence.
There's a question here, in fact, when you're talking about experiments, what kind of activities would you suggest to encourage the scientific, in quotes, type behavior in an everyday life of an 18-month-old? Again, before you answer that, there is a sequence, a nice sequence in Human Quest of Alison explaining, we're watching a child that is constantly dropping a spoon. Remember this? Dropping a spoon. It's about 12 months old, maybe. That was an experiment that you described as the child seeing what the result would be in the environment. And the environment was, of course, the poor old mother had to pick the thing up every time and give it back to her. So it was training the mother was the experiment. So what kind of activities would you suggest to encourage? And there's two questions like that, in fact. What kind of toys could people buy for their...
Well, this actually gets back to your question, Roger, which is one of the things that's so striking about this is that the children are incredibly good at figuring out what the activities are that are going to teach them the most. And my rule of thumb is if they're giggling, that means that they're learning. And especially if they're giggling and you're giggling, that definitely means that they're learning. And they're very good at figuring out which things are going to be relevant to their particular problems. And what that means is that a lot of the things that people think are learning activities for adults, because adults are so slow relatively, like reading and writing and doing math and all that, those aren't the things that are learning activities for children. The things that children are doing spontaneously anyway, at least children under 5, playing, all the things that are the great old classic toys, putting rings on a stick, playing with refrigerator boxes, getting into mixing bowls. Those are the things that are actually teaching children. So the thing to do is to find out what the kids want to do when you're talking about 18-month-olds, what they want to play with, and let them play with it. That's the secret. Not go out and buy the $100 electronic learning toy. And also to be sort of around so that if the children are quite good at giving adults around them signals about what extra information, what they want to do next, what they want to find out about next. Which I also wanted to say something about your example of Delhi. It's interesting that if you look across cultures, it is true that by the time you've got 7 or 8 or 9-year-olds, they're actually already starting to be productive members of the society. But if you look across cultures from 0 to 5, and in most cultures there's a fairly clear break, there's a thing that happens around 5 or 6, which says you're not a baby anymore. The babies, the ones who are 0 to 5, are being put in this protected, sheltered environment. It isn't always the mom who's doing it. It could be a grandmother, it could be an older sib, but they are in this protected, sheltered environment. And I think there's a lot of evidence that if they aren't, if they're under various kinds of stress, their learning really suffers. Even their brain development suffers. So I do think that when you're talking at least about 0 to 5-year-olds, that we have some empirical evidence that nurturance, that love, that protection, that sense of not being under stress to actually be out there in the biological marketplace is really important to have this kind of relaxed learning. Which is not to say that there aren't things that you learn later on in the stress of the marketplace, but I think that protected period is actually very important.
There's one for you, Christoph. Do animals have consciousness? And by implication, do they any, I think this one asks also, do they have any rights, and how do you protect those animals during experiments?
Yeah, the working hypothesis is for most of us that at least some animals have consciousness, where they lack the most distinguished difference between us. A, they don't talk, by and large, and B, they don't have, even higher primates don't have nearly as much self-consciousness as we do. So they don't know about death, they don't know about Macintosh or about, the vote. But certainly mammals have sensations. It's like I say, it's more difficult right now because we don't have any absolute test yet. It's more difficult to define where does it end, where does it begin, at what species level. Ultimately, of course, this will have consequences for animal rights, because if animals are conscious versus a creature that's just all reflex, that's just a non-sentient, a non-feeling machine, as it were, I guess one could accord less rights to a creature such as yourself. And then it's a question of trade-off. Are you willing to help cure AIDS? Are you willing to prevent, SIDS or schizophrenia? And if that requires, are you willing to make the trade-off that versus doing animal experiments? That's a debate society at large then has to go through. But the assumption is that at least mammals share most of consciousness with us.
Could you do a little follow-up there as well on the what appeared to be the democratic presidential neuron that you identify? What does that lead you to in terms of thinking about the structure of the brain, the structure of neural networks, and so on and so forth? I mean, where do you think the information is stored?
Well, I mean, it has to do with the question that Hume has asked 300 years ago: how do you represent information in your brain? So there are two extreme ways to do it. One is if you think about anything like, George W., or you think the idea of justice, or you think of the idea of, of LA as a mecca of the entertainment industry. Any of these ideas could be implemented by a network that has, let's say, 10 million members, and the exact pattern, if you think of justice, the Platonic idea of justice, is one particular set of neurons, of these 10 million neurons firing. And if you think about, Abu Ghraib scandal, then it's a different set of neurons or it's the same set of neurons that fires in slightly different ways. So in other words, in order to understand anything in the brain, you have these very large collection of neurons. However, the other extreme that some people have advocated is that for things that you're very familiar with, for things that you think all the time, your loved ones, your family, people you see on TV, famous politicians, things that if you're a lawyer, you will hopefully think about justice all the time, that they are a discrete set of neurons that only fire to those. So it's a much more discrete, it's called a grandmother and representation. The idea being, if you're raised by your grandmother, there are a set of neurons that fire to your grandmother, and there's another set of neurons that fire to your grandfather, etc. And here we seem to have discovered such a representation, and it has important implications for how any information ultimately is represented in the brain, and how you can influence it. For example, if you think about, doing a prosthetic device, going inside the brain and, putting electrodes to change perception, is that possible, and how is that possible?
But if your Clinton neuron died, would Clinton disappear from your brain?
What maybe, it's a good question. People always laugh and say, well, that's ridiculous. It may well be. And so by and large, if one Clinton neuron dies, you probably don't have an effect. However, it may well be that if one neuron dies, you may have a slight hesitation. Clinton, oh yeah, that was the president. And then if I take out 3 or 4 or 5 of these neurons, if I could find them, then you would say, oh yeah, I remember there was in the late 90s, what's his name again? There was that president, remember, was that scandal? So it's well possible that, because if you test, it's just not true. There used to be the theory that the brain is a hologram and you can cut out large chunks of it, it makes no difference. That's BS. If you look at any brain, in an adult has a specific function. If you take out that brain, you may see, if you test it carefully enough, a specific loss of function.
Although it is interesting that, you mentioned that it's an adult brain. It is interesting that exactly a contrast that you see is that if you take a child brain, then you see this enormous recovery, so that you can have big chunks of children's brains. You can have children with hydrocephaly who end up with, a half an inch of cortex left, who go to college, who develop normally. So there's something that's happening, again, between this tremendous plasticity in the child brain and then this much more specified function that you see in the adult brain.
And Michael, on the Persinger thing, question here, did you run a control? In other words, did you sit for an hour with a helmet on but no computer connection?
Yeah, that's the control.
See you doing that.
I would be more impressed with Persinger if he had better controls like that, because in fact, if you do, like in the 70s, I tried the isolation tanks, but all this was part of my drug-free and legal ways of having hallucinations, because I thought I might want to use my brain again someday. Same reason I don't use performance-enhancing drugs, and therefore I'm kind of slow.
Yeah.
But yeah, sure. If you sit in an isolation tank, you have a flood of thoughts and feelings of floating, of course, because you're in a tank. But and in fact, in Persinger's lab, you're in this like big cushion chair, one of those not a Barker lounge, the things with the Homer type chair. And so it is kind of that sense of, so it's hard to say whether it's one way or the other, and more controls would be better. The other thing about Persinger is that He thinks there is such a thing as the paranormal that needs a scientific explanation. So here I disagree. I think there's nothing that needs to be explained in that sense. He thinks people can somehow maybe connect to one another telepathically, something like that, maybe, and he might be able to discern which part of the brain is doing this in a scientific way. So he's doing good science within a parameter that I think is probably not correct. And then the other thing he thinks that these, because I asked him, what would trigger these things? You've got these solenoids right there. Where would this happen in the real world that would cause people to have alien abductions or sense of presence or out-of-body experiences or whatever? And so he kind of has this postulation about earthquakes, thrust faults cause magnetic fields and so on. And I thought, well, yeah, we do have a lot of weird things in Southern California where there's a lot of earthquake activity. But with the dissipation of energy over the square of the distance, I mean, come on, you know, it's a long ways to the fault line from my brain to it. What are the chances that it's pounding on it, not yours? Why did I have it? I don't think he's got the answer, but it's an interesting way to try to get to it.
He is at a very interesting place in the brain, though, because it's known that some types of people who have epileptic seizures, including if you go back in history, Jean of Arc or St. Paul, on his conversion experience on the road to Damascus, that some type of epileptic seizures associated with experiential experiences, that people have a particular type of seizure that by and large happens in the medial temporal lobe, which is where he thinks he stimulates. Sometimes these seizures can go ahead with intense religious ideation, intense feeling of presence. Sometimes if you're non-religious, it's just present. Even non-religious people have this feeling there's something there above and beyond them. If you're very religious, of course, you think it's God. And it tends to be expressed when you have this hyper-synchronized pathological activity in this particular part of the brain, for reasons we don't understand.
Yeah, the term neurotheology, which I think Rama would have spoken about had he been here, I'm not sure if you knew this, but it actually turns up in that wonderful novel by Aldous Huxley called Island, where he talks about a lot of these issues. Alison, there is a question which may have been prompted by Larry Summers, president of Harvard's latest remarks, but somebody has asked, was there a gender difference in the way the kids dealt with the gear problem, apart from the boys beating the other ones up?
Right. The answer is there isn't. And it's worth pointing out. In fact, I just was involved in a debate about this on the website, on the EDGE website. It's a real problem because for us developmental psychologists, of course, we do sort of look at gender the way we look at other things when we're doing our experiments. But of course, when we have negative findings, which is almost all of the time, that doesn't really count as a result. So for example, Simon Baron-Cohen thinks that there's these big gender differences in children's ability to understand psychology, which I mentioned before, and their ability to understand physical things, like the gear toy that I showed you. We've tested hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children. We've never seen any gender differences in those, along those dimensions. Now, there may be some. I mean, certainly there's evidence that boys, for instance, tend to be physically more active on a large scale than girls at preschool. And that may make a big difference to the kinds of experiences they have and the kinds of things they learn about. But on our tasks, we see both the boys and the girls being just as curious, just as inquisitive, just as involved in figuring out what's going on. And as I say, I think overall, there's this kind of asymmetry because when you don't find gender differences, you don't report them and they just kind of disappear, whereas when people do find them, then they get a lot more attention.
If some of these qualities that we're supposed to have, these vaunted qualities like doing statistical inferences and to figure out causality, having a cheater detection mechanism if you're an EV-Psych person, why are we so bad at a lot of these things? I mean, an intuition. Why are we so bad at catching scam artists? Why are we so bad at actually inferring the statistical qualities of the environment and so on? We really don't do a very good job of this.
Well, the scam artists are kind of interesting because, of course, one of the things that you might expect is I think there's a bit of a cognitive arms race within human beings because one of the things that we realize, of course, when we start figuring out the causal structure of the world is what it is that other people think about the causal structure of the world. And I think from very early on, all those magicians that we saw yesterday and the scam artists, just like they're using our perceptual system to get us to see things that aren't there, they're also using our causal inference system to get us to believe in causal links that aren't there. And in fact, magicians, I think most of what they do is they do one or the other. They persuade us that something's disappeared, or they persuade us that something made something else happen, that the thought in your head actually was the cause of the thought in my head. And I think people actually start exploiting our ability to make these inferences to get power and authority and all the rest. So I think, Roger, it's like the perceptual illusions. You know, every vision scientist will show you a zillion amazing perceptual illusions. They don't show that we're bad at seeing things. In fact, they show that we're really good at seeing things, but because we're designed to see things in particular kinds of environments, if you shift around the environment, we can make terrible mistakes. So again, I think if you think about a child's environment, or even maybe an environment in which we have lots of opportunities to get evidence, we have lots of opportunities to intervene, then I think our statistics is actually, our causal inference is actually very good. It's in very special environments. And interestingly enough, I think charlatans, cultists, magicians over the years have worked out exactly what those environments are and created them. We can actually create special environments in which we will make systematic kinds of mistakes in those kinds of inference. So I don't think that shows that we're not good at it. In some ways, it almost shows that we are good at it because we can create special circumstances in which we'll make very systematic mistakes, the same way that perceptual illusions actually show how good we are at seeing, not how bad we are at seeing.
On that point, Christoph, though, this is actually on the same point. Would the gorilla suit thing have worked, is the question here, in a 3D environment? In other words, if somebody was doing it on a stage.
Yes, if you give sufficient distracting, I mean, you see it every day in accidents that happen that are unexplained, when plain broad daylight, without foul play, without alcohol, people run into each other. And so now, it happens all the time. Recently there was this 2 years ago, this terrible tragedy in Taipei where an airliner landed, tried to take off from a runway, which was blocked, was clearly visible. The investigation concluded the pilot failed to see it, inattentional blinding. He just didn't see what was clearly marked. Yes, so it can happen also. I want to say something to Alison, because I think you're maybe overestimating the cognitive power of children. I mean, the problem you showed us was a one-dimensional variable. The problem scientists deal with today in medicine and biology have hundreds of free variables, or thousands of free variables. If you look at cancer, it's it caused maybe by a combination of 30 different genes out of 30,000, we don't know which 31, combined with all sorts of environmental insult. And so you have to manipulate these incredible high-dimensional variables, which is, I submit, substantially more difficult than having a system where you have one variable and you tweak it here or here, right? So.
Well, I think part of the reason why part of the reason why children are so successful, another reason why they're so successful, is because what they do is break up, what evolution does in a sense for them, is break up these big problems into what start out initially as being relatively simple problems, with just, say, 3 or 4 variables, with a limited variety of causal hypotheses that you can do. And then there's this kind of bootstrapping effect where, by doing that, now you have a new set of problems. Now you have a new set of explorations that you can do. You can take the output of those problems and make still further inferences. And again, if you want to say why are people bad at, why are adults bad? It is because we're bad at considering, say, 20 or 30 variables at once. I think we are bad at doing that. But the idea is that the basic inferential processes are not things that we're bad at, that we're fundamentally rational. And if we can make contact with these fundamentally rational pieces, where when we teach, for instance, when we can actually say to people, here's the problem and here's the answer, then I think we are much more rational. And I think even if you look at, the wild, crazy, paranormal kind of stuff, it's interesting that people feel the need to defend those claims. So, I mean, the fact that there's creation science in some ways seems to me to be terribly hopeful, because you'd think that if you were really a creationist, Thomas Aquinas, I think, said this, what do you mean I have to defend this? What do you mean I have to provide evidence for it? This is divine revelation. It's just divine revelation. And the fact that instead of just saying, why it is that we know that Darwin is wrong? Because God said so. That's why, right? I mean, you could say that. And in fact, that's not what people do. They make up all these elaborate stories about, oh, well, there's this evidence and there's that evidence. And it seems to me that shows that deep down inside, people really do care about evidence. The big issue is, how do you get the right evidence? How do you decide what evidence you're going to believe and what evidence you're not going to believe, and so on? One of the things that's interesting with children is up till 5, a lot of the evidence they're using is this evidence that comes from their own direct experience. When they get to be about 4 or 5, suddenly they start taking on board a whole lot of evidence from other people. They start taking what other people say to them and treating it as if that's relevant evidence too. And of course, that's an enormously good thing to do. That's part of what enables us to have culture, is that we can take information from other people and use it. But it has terrible costs as well, because if that information is wrong, then you're going to draw the wrong conclusions. So it's not irrational if someone came up to you and said, I was on a road and I was stopped and there was a bright light and I was taken up by aliens. If you think that what that person is saying is likely to be true, it's not irrational to believe that that could happen. That's a perfectly rational conclusion to draw. So there's things about, there's lots of reasons, I think, why we could have these fundamentally very accurate mechanisms that could end up in special circumstances leading us to inaccuracies.
I don't think, though, there's special circumstances. You look at the bubble. Remember the bubble? Remember the stock bubble?
Right.
Everybody managed to convince themselves it would just go up and up and up. So I think these special circumstances exist all the time, that throughout much of our lives we live in these fictitious stories that are just based on, not on any facts, but on beliefs, and not on rational beliefs either.
Well, I guess I would say we often are doing it on beliefs. I'm not sure that they're not rational beliefs,
Well,
given the premises.
Within the constraints of the belief system, there's a logic within it.
Yeah.
Now, the whole system may be flawed, but the steps within it. So my new approach with intelligent design creationists now is to say, or to anybody I'm talking to, why do you believe in God? Because it looks like it's designed. You're right, it does look like it's designed. Right. It was designed, but it's a bottom-up designer called natural selection that tinkers along. So it is designed. We'll give you the design argument, but who's the designer, or what's the designer?
Here's one of the old chestnuts that you've all probably had to answer before. Probably, Michael, you do it from a different perspective. How much of the brain is actually being used? If at all. No. Sorry, that was inappropriate in addition. Does the brain...
If you buy my book, I can tell you it's only 10%.
Does the brain have a maximum capacity for thinking and remembering? There's another thing connected to this, Christoph, while you're on it. Has anyone tested visual percepts for correlation to handedness? Obviously, some right-handed people here want to be...
Probably left-handed people.
All those questions and more will be revealed in my book. That's available for $9.99 outside. No, so if you look in an adult brain, I mean, it's very different before puberty, but after puberty, there's somewhat less plasticity. It's still plasticity, but less. Then, like I said, every time you remove a part of the brain, you can find a specific deficit. Now, sometimes it's not easy to find. So, for example, you may know about the split brain experiments that were done here at Caltech, for which Roger Sperry got the Nobel Prize. You know, where you cut the entire corpus callosum, 200 million fibers connecting the left and the right brain. It turned out that operation was first done in 1939 by surgeons to alleviate massive epileptic seizures. It was done for 15 years, and people by and large couldn't find any deficits. Now, right now, if there's a split brain patient, if you do the right thing, you can find out their profound deficits, like you're only talking to half of their brain, right? They're profound deficits that you can elicit immediately now that you know what to test for. So likewise, when people claim that you only use 10% of the brain, it's not true in the sense that if I take out any one part of your brain, there will be specific deficits that I can test. People have not found memory capacity limitation. They did these experiments, very heroic ones, by standing in University of Pennsylvania in the 50s. They gave them up where persons were supposed to recognize images, and they gave up a few 10,000 images because people could still, with far better than chance probability, recognize images. And after a while, it just got to 10 years. So we don't really understand what are the limits on memory, and is the limits more that we tend to forget things, or that we just don't encode them properly, and there's interference with the encoding? We don't know right now.
There's a question there that asks you all to comment on what you think about the blank slate notion. Let me set that up a little bit. There's a couple of clips in there with Steve where he talks first of all about language and basically says everywhere on the planet children have language. If you take take two children, put them down in Japan, one's English, one's Japanese, they'll end up speaking Japanese. But if you do that with a gerbil and have the gerbil sitting there listening to the conversations, what will end up is that the kids will end up speaking English and Japanese, but the gerbil will not. And that's because the gerbil does not have capacities, a language instinct, as we would describe it. He then goes on to talk about the notion of the blank slate as being a totalitarian's dream, in the sense that if there is nothing built in, nothing innate, then you can go to thought training camps and you'll end up being brainwashed. I mean, these obviously extreme positions, and I think that's the problem with the whole notion, but would you like to comment on the whole notion of innate versus learned?
Well, I think it's one of these multifactorial problems we just talked about. It's not just one. I mean, it's not just genes, not just environments, it's both. There are lots and lots of examples for that. Essentially, we are given by natural selection, we're given this brain at birth called neocortex. Well, what makes us really different that we have a much more neocortex than most other mammals. And this allows us to make inferences about the world. It allows us to make prediction about the world. And that's as Alison had showed in her patients, in her children. That's what we grow up with. Now it depends on the environment we're born with. If we're deprived, if we don't get enough to eat, if we get beaten, etc., then those things don't have a chance to develop. But if we do get the proper nourishing environment, then we can develop to the fullest of our potential those things that we evolved for, which is to think and to run and to enjoy and to enjoy life. So it's always a combination of both genes and environment. It's never nurture. So I mean, Roger said that it's not really this, it's a false dichotomy to say, is it nurture or is it nature? What you can ask is what's the percentage contribution? Is it this trait more genetically inherited like IQ, or is it more environmental dependent? But even that is very dicey because we don't, many of these things like IQ or like other psychological factors are probably formed by 10s or 20s or 30s or 50s of different genes interacting in very, very complicated ways. So right now, the honest answer is we just don't know, and the answer is going to be both of the above in some complicated manner.
You know, I think it's even more of a misguided question than that. So what people often say is, well, look, it has to be some complicated combination of the two, and it has to be genes and environment interacting, all of which is true, and it's got to be some percent of one and some percent of another. But there's some distinctive things about human beings that really make that question deeply incoherent for human beings. And the thing that's so distinctive about human beings is that we create our own environments. So if you're trying to calculate, for example, how much are genes responsible for a trait and how much is an environment responsible for the trait, you have to know what people sometimes call the range of reaction of the genes. What's the range of environments in which this gene is going to be manifested? That's the only way that you can make any kind of claim about how much the gene is contributing to the trait. Now, for human beings, what happens is that we actually have this amazing capacity to create our own novel environments. That's our trick. That's what our genes enable us to do. And what that means is that we have this very peculiar situation where our genes actually enable us to, say, represent the causal structure of the environment and intervene and make that environment into a different environment than it would otherwise have been. And now our genes are living in this new environment that we actually created. And the result of that is that it's sort of impossible. It's not just sort of, well, it's some percent in another. Let me give you a very simple but very dramatic example of this. You probably know there's a syndrome called phenylketonuria, which all babies, when babies get that little prick in their heels, it's to test for it. And it's a particular kind of amino acid problem, which means that the children can't actually metabolize certain proteins in food, and they suffer from terrible retardation and die. Now, of course, what we do as human beings is we test for that, and we make sure that if children have this syndrome, they don't get that particular protein in their food, and they don't get retarded anymore. So what's the relationship between the retardation and phenylketonuria? Is it environment or is it genes? What percentage is environment and what percentage is genes? Well, it's 100% genes, because if you have the gene, you'll be susceptible to the syndrome. And it's 100% environment, because if you change the environment, no one will ever suffer from phenylketonuria retardation before. And it is because we have this incredible capacity to actually say, oh, okay, we can think about phenylketonuria. If you were an animal that couldn't represent the world, there would be a direct relationship between the gene and the syndrome. But because we can create a new environment in which that gene no longer has that, leads to that trait, there's a sense in which it isn't even coherent to talk about a percentage that comes from one place and a percentage that comes from another place.
Well,
maybe,
but we should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. We should not throw out the many
which doesn't
factors.
mean that doesn't mean that there isn't anything to say about it. Of course, you can tell for any specific case, you can tell a very specific story about here's what the genes do, here's what the environment does, here's the environmental cascade that results, here's what this gene will do in this environment. But that doesn't necessarily tell you that that's what a gene will do in any environment. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, you're right. It won't tell us what it'll do in any environment because, of course, it's impossible to enumerate all possible environments. But, for example, you take a trait like aggressiveness, okay? Very strong link between testosterone levels, GY or XX or XY, male or female, and aggressiveness. Been true throughout history, been true in all culture. You can plot, for example, lifetime, excess death. John Norman has a beautiful plot in his book where you just plot the ratio of dying in any particular age cohort between males and females. And so you see between, the age of 0 and 15, it's more or less equal. Then between 15 and 35, you get 3 times more boys or men that die because of doing stupid things, right? Running, drinking and climbing and homicide, etc. Okay, now this link with aggressiveness relates also to testosterone. It seems to be true in all cultures where people have checked, and seems to be true even, as far as back we can see in history. So in that sense, that seems to be a trait that seems to be heavily co-regulated with genes. And to say, we can probably totally disconnect that or dissociate that link is probably extremely unlikely in my eyes.
Well, I don't think the point is not that genes don't contribute, but the point is that being able to say this is a percentage of which they contribute versus an environment, I think is a misguided way of thinking about it. I mean, take another gender example, just to choose one at random. For instance, suppose you thought there might be a connection between gender and mathematical and scientific ability, just to choose an example at random. Well, the truth is, in the environment in which we adapted, there was absolutely no genetic contribution to having a mathematics position at Harvard, right? There was no difference between the number of men and the number of women in the Pleistocene who had mathematics positions in the department at Harvard. Because, of course, there were no mathematics positions, and there was no Harvard to have mathematics positions at. In that environment, so that when we say, well, there's this trait doing well at mathematics, that's a trait that only makes sense in an environment in which mathematics is a possibility. On the other hand, in the environment in which my own mother grew up, there was an absolute relationship between genetics and the ability to get a mathematics degree at the University of Pennsylvania because women weren't allowed in any of the mathematics programs. So women weren't actually allowed to take the advanced mathematics courses. So there was a very straightforward relationship between her genome and her mathematics ability in that context. The trouble is that we just don't know. So both of those are cases where you say, well, but come on. I mean, that doesn't really count. The trouble is, since we don't know what the range of environments are, we don't know for these sophisticated social and cultural traits, which are the ones that really matter to us, what that means outside of a range of environments. I don't think there's anything very informative to say about what contribution there might or might not be of genes and environments in those cases.
To name another random gender example, okay, which is, you name another example is color vision, okay, very well explored. So it turns out there are many of you here who are colorblind, who probably only have 2 photoreceptor pigments for cones, okay? Now, by and large, 10 to 1, those of you who have this defect are going to be men, right? We know all about the genetics associated with the sex gene. We understand the linkage. It turns out that many women, in fact, have so most of us have 3 photopigments for normal red, green, and blue. A lot of women have expressed in the retina photopigments for 4. They have the 2 different red alleles, and then they have green and blue. So those women would have super color resolution. And as I said, sort of men in poetic justice, many men only have 2. This is entirely due to genetics, okay? It's something that whether or not you express a particular gene that turns out a particular protein in our eyes. It's a complicated thing relating to aesthetic perception.
We'll have one more example.
But doesn't it follow from that if men and women both go shopping, since women see less choices, that they ought to shop more quickly than men? Can I just, there was one final question. It was a question for me which says, is your view a refutation of evolutionary psychology or a more simply trying to redefine words like plasticity and other amorphous words like module? No, in fact, it's a refutation. There is a lot of debate about what is exactly meant by a module, and if you read philosophers, psychologists, neuropsychologists, neuroscience, they're all different definitions, and I think it's fruitless to worry too much about that. I think what we're talking about here is very much the important organ, if you want to call it an organ here, is the plasticity of the neocortex, the fact that you can build what we call adaptive representational networks in there, which, as I said, consist essentially of a a yoking together of a stimulus environment, an internal state, a state change, a behavior that you emit, and then a system which is calibrating whether what you did is making your life better or worse. And those little 4-frame movies, if you think of them, we think of them as the sort of fundamental units of intelligence, and that each of us builds up huge databases of these as we navigate through our different through our different lives and different marketplaces, which is why the book is called The Origin of Minds, meaning that there are 6 billion of them, not just a universal human mind. So if you think of what the example Alison gave earlier of being in Paris in the spring and falling in love, that in that little 4-frame movie, there's a lot of things being pulled at one time. You've got a new stimulus environment, you've got coursing neurochemicals going on, you've got an internal state change. I don't think there's anything in the standard EP model that can truly explain that. This is much more a prediction reward neuroscience kind of analysis that we brought together with the adaptationist perspective and blended them together. So it's very hard to teach an old dog new tricks, but you can do it if you change the environment. If you want to change your mind, change the environment. So if you want to change your mind about feeling hungry now, we should change the environment, Michael.
By setting him to lunch, yes. One housekeeping note, we'll come back we have plenty of time for lunch, so we'll cut lunch short by 10 minutes. Just come back 10 minutes earlier than it says in the schedule, which I forget what time it says we're supposed to be done, but just come back 10 minutes earlier, we'll start. We've got plenty of time. The food should be out there. We'll see you out there.
Yeah, let's just cut that. We just interviewed